V-Gans Redemption, Episode 1, Shadows and Light. Created by Slick Euphoric. Prologue, Shadows in the Night. The city of Verde Heights had always been known for its towering green spaces, a marvel of urban harmony that seemed almost surreal in its beauty. But tonight, under the cover of a moonless sky, that beauty felt fragile, as if it could be shattered by the secrets hiding within. In an abandoned observatory on the city's outskirts, a figure moved with silent precision. A dark cloak swept across the marble floors, and the metallic scent of rain-laced wind carried through the shattered windows. The figure stopped at a console flickering with forgotten data. Files on V-Gan, the city's enigmatic protector. His victories, his origins, and, most importantly, the day Lane Patrick died. Fingers in sleek black gloves tapped a sequence, bringing up a hidden file labeled Project Renewal. A whisper cut through the silence. He won't be ready. The figure smirked, the glow of the screen reflecting in their eyes, sharp and calculating. Not until we make him bleed, came the reply, almost lost in the growl of approaching thunder. A distant siren wailed, and the city below hummed in blissful ignorance. But change was coming. Not just any change, something orchestrated with ruthless intent. And V-Gan was at the center of it all, whether he knew it or not. Chapter 1. The Wounded Hero. The dawn sky broke over Verde Heights, painting the city in a wash of crimson and gold. V-Gan stood on the ledge of the city's tallest building, eyes narrowed against the bitter wind. The weight of the morning sun felt foreign on his broad shoulders, like the spotlight of an interrogator questioning his soul. Lane's voice echoed in his mind, a ghostly remnant of a life that no longer existed. Stay true, no matter the cost. The words, once a balm, now cut him with a serrated edge. How could he stay true when the world seemed so intent on revealing the darkness within? He scanned the streets below. The people moved like ants, oblivious to the battle raging above their heads. Not the battles of fists and machines that the city knew, but the silent war inside him. He still wore the cape of his former self, though its vibrant green seemed muted, a reflection of the man he was trying not to become. Haunting the skyline again? The voice startled him, low and rich with a sardonic edge. Captain Riker Stone, the man who once led the city's elite defense force, stepped out from the shadows, his silhouette sharp against the rising sun. He had the look of someone who'd seen too many battles and learned to thrive in the chaos they left behind. V-Gan's jaw tightened. "This isn't your fight, Riker." Riker tilted his head, a smile playing on his lips. "Isn't it? I thought we were all fighting for something here, even if it's just a shadow of what we used to believe in." Silence hung between them like a blade. Riker's eyes, cold and calculating, caught V-Gan's. There was a challenge there, but something deeper too. Recognition, perhaps? The moment stretched until V-Gan looked away, unable to confront the question in Riker's gaze. The captain's voice softened, only slightly. "The city's on edge. They look to you, but they're losing faith." "And you think I can't feel that?" V-Gan snapped, the anger in his voice a poorly disguised defense. He regretted it immediately, the way Riker's smirk turned bitter. "Maybe it's time you ask yourself why, hero," Riker said, turning on his heel and vanishing into the maze of the rooftop's shadows. V-Gan stayed rooted in place, eyes closed, listening to the pulse of the city below. Each beat seemed to sync with the doubts clawing at him, echoing the words that kept him on this precipice day after day. What will you do when staying true costs you everything? Chapter 2. Allies and Rivals. The morning sun glistened off the glass towers of Verde Heights, their mirrored surfaces casting beams of light onto the bustling streets below. The city was alive with the murmurs of early commuters, their footsteps an orchestrated symphony against the backdrop of chirping birds in the carefully preserved greenery that lined the avenues. But from the window of Sarah Elara's office, the world below seemed distant, almost like a scene in a snow globe, untouched by the harsh realities that haunted its inhabitants. Sarah took a slow, deliberate sip of her coffee, letting the bitter taste cut through the tension coiling in her chest. Today was different. The air seemed charged, the anticipation gnawing at her composure. The shelves behind her, filled with books on psychological trauma, cognitive therapy, and the study of post-heroic syndrome felt like silent witnesses to what was about to unfold. Her office was warm and inviting by design, a refuge for the broken and weary. Rich dark woods and earth-toned furniture absorbed the light that spilled through the wide windows, creating an atmosphere that whispered trust. Yet, despite the setting, Sira's mind raced, questions swirling in a dance of doubt and determination. She had studied heroes before, their minds fractured by the weight of saving the world, but V-Gan was different. He was not a hero forged in the fires of ambition or ideology, but something more primal, more enigmatic. A sharp knock at the door shattered her thoughts, and she set her cup down, the porcelain clinking against the wood with a sound louder than she intended. "Dr. Ilara, he's here," came the voice from the other side, a clipped announcement from her assistant, whose tone betrayed both awe and wariness. Sira took a breath to steady herself. "Send him in," she said, brushing an errant strand of auburn hair behind her ear and adjusting the collar of her cream blouse. The door opened and the atmosphere shifted. V-Gans stepped into the room, and for a moment the space felt smaller, charged with an invisible current. He was taller than she'd imagined, every muscle defined beneath the tailored green suit that bore the scars of countless battles. His eyes, dark and searching, swept across the room with the practiced vigilance of a soldier scanning for threats. There was something feral in his gaze, a tension coiled tight like a spring. "Dr. Ilara," he said, his voice deep and resonant, carrying the weight of command, of expectation. "Please, call me Sarah," she said, gesturing to the chair across from her. "Thank you for coming. I know this isn't easy." He remained standing, eyes locked on the panoramic view behind her, as if it offered answers to questions he hadn't yet dared to ask. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken words, until he broke it, his tone guarded. "Did Riker send you?" The question surprised her, but she kept her expression neutral, her psychologist's mask firmly in place. "No," she said, leaning back to study him. "This was my request. I wanted to meet the hero I've read so much about, the man behind the stories." He turned to face her, and for a moment she felt the full force of his scrutiny. His jaw was set, eyes narrowed, but beneath the stoic exterior she saw it. A flicker of something raw and wounded, vulnerability. It vanished almost as quickly as it appeared, replaced by the practiced detachment of someone who had learned to survive by showing nothing at all. "Hero," he repeated, the word a bitter mockery on his tongue. He moved to the chair and sat, the motion fluid, yet every muscle seemed coiled, ready for an unseen battle. "Is that what they call me now?" Sira's gaze softened, but her mind remained sharp, cataloguing every detail. The tension in his shoulders, the way his hands curled into fists and relaxed, as if trying to remember the feel of peace. "That depends on who you ask. But that's why I wanted to talk, to understand what you think you are." A bitter smile ghosted across his lips, and he leaned back, eyes drifting to the ceiling, as if the answer might be written there. "What I think," he scoffed, the sound devoid of humor. "I think I'm a man who let the one person who believed in him die." The confession lingered between them, heavy and unyielding. Sarah felt a pang of sorrow, a kind of professional empathy that reached beyond the boundaries of her work. Here was a man who had moved mountains, who had carried the city's hopes on his back, and yet he was crumbling under the weight of a single loss. "Tell me about Lane," she prompted gently, watching as his expression shifted from cold detachment to something that cracked at the edges. "Lane." The name fell from his lips, reverent and broken. He looked down, eyes unfocused as if seeing a different time, a different place. He was the light in a world that felt perpetually dark. He believed in justice, in compassion, even when the world gave him every reason not to. And he believed in me, when I didn't even believe in myself. The silence that followed was deafening. Sirah watched him struggle, his chest rising and falling, with breaths that seemed to carry the weight of years. She wanted to reach out, to touch his hand, to bridge the gap between them, but she stayed rooted in place, letting the moment pass naturally. "And now?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Now?" His eyes lifted, stormy and unfathomable. "Now I'm just a man trying not to drown in the guilt that eats me alive every damn day." Before she could respond, a sharp knock at the door interrupted. and it swung open to reveal Captain Riker Stone. His presence was as imposing as ever, with sharp, angular features and eyes that seemed to cut through whatever facade you tried to wear. He nodded curtly at Sierra before fixing his gaze on V-Gan. "We have a situation," he said, his voice rough, the urgency in it slicing through the air. "Dr. Vasquez has been sighted at the industrial sector. It's happening." V-Gan stood, the vulnerability that had momentarily surfaced locked away behind a mask of resolve. He was all steel and sinew now, a man ready for battle. He didn't look back at Sierra as he strode past Riker and out the door, leaving a wake of tension that rippled through the room. Sierra exhaled, a shiver coursing through her as the door closed behind them. She turned her gaze back to the city, heart pounding. This was more than she had bargained for, and she knew, deep down, that the storm was just beginning. Chapter 3: The Dark Shadows of Verde Heights. The streets of Verde Heights were a chaotic symphony of industry and decay. The industrial sector, a stark contrast to the city's verdant parks and shining skyscrapers, stretched out like a labyrinth of forgotten promises. Pipes hissed steam into the air, and the tang of rust and oil clung to everything like a stubborn ghost. This was where Dr. Thorne Vasquez thrived, a man whose genius was matched only by the darkness of his ambitions. Vasquez stood in the heart of his makeshift lab, an old factory repurposed into a fortress of twisted metal and flickering screens. Tubes ran across the ceiling, glowing with neon green liquid that pulsed rhythmically, like veins carrying lifeblood to a monstrous creation. He adjusted his glasses, the lenses catching the eerie light, making his eyes look larger and more feral. The sound of machinery whirring behind him was both a lullaby and a battle drum, an anthem to his own brilliance. His fingers danced over a console, inputting commands that sent the liquid coursing faster. He glanced up at the transparent chamber at the center of the room, where a humanoid silhouette shifted, suspended in the glowing fluid. It was almost ready. "You're playing a dangerous game, Thorne." A voice purred from the shadows, lilting and mocking. Vasquez didn't flinch. He knew that voice well. "Spectre," he said, more an acknowledgement than a greeting. He didn't turn as the figure emerged from the darkness, a lithe figure draped in a suit so black it seemed to absorb the light around it. The Spectre's face was obscured by a mask that covered all but their eyes, sharp and watchful, taking in every detail. "What do you want?" Vasquez asked, finally turning with the slow, deliberate movements of a man who feared nothing, not even this deadly operative. The Spectre stepped closer, the soft rustle of fabric barely registering over the hum of machines. "I heard your name whispered in places where it shouldn't be, Thorne. You've drawn attention. V-Gan won't let this slide, and you know it." Vasquez's lips curled into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Let him come," he said, spreading his arms wide as if to embrace an unseen audience. "I've been preparing for him." The Spectre tilted their head, a gesture that was almost feline. "And if he isn't the only one who comes? If others join the fray, Captain Stone, that meddling psychologist, even the super-fart monster you once deemed an abomination?" Vasquez's eyes flickered with interest at the mention of Syrah. "Ah, Dr. Elara, always poking into places that should remain closed. Let her come too. It will be educational." The Spectre's eyes narrowed, a glimmer of frustration breaking through their practiced calm. They had worked with Vasquez before, back when their allegiances were simpler, when the lines between ally and enemy were stark and defined. Now those lines had blurred, twisted by ambition, betrayal, and survival. "Don't underestimate them, Thorne," the Spectre warned. "V-Gans broken, yes, but broken things have sharp edges. And Riker is relentless. He'll follow you into the dark and drag you out by your throat if it means saving this city." The scientist's smile faltered for just a moment, enough for the Spectre to catch it. But Vasquez recovered, stepping forward until only a breath separated them. "You forget," he whispered. "I don't fear the dark. I am the dark." The Spectre's eyes met his, unblinking. "Then I hope you're ready when it swallows you whole." Without another word, the Spectre melted back into the shadows, their presence dissipating like smoke. Vasquez watched the place where they had stood, a muscle in his jaw ticking as the silence stretched. He turned back to the chamber, placing a palm against the cool glass. The figure inside twitched, the liquid bubbling around it in a response that felt almost sentient. "Soon," Vasquez murmured. "Very soon." V-Gans' reckoning. The wind bit at V-Gans' face as he stood atop the rooftop of an abandoned warehouse, Riker at his side, the city sprawling beneath them like a living, breathing entity. The industrial sector loomed before them, a maze of towering smokestacks and metal skeletons that glistened with dew under the steel-grey sky. Riker was the first to break the silence, his voice cutting through the cold like a blade. "I've got my team on standby, but they won't move without confirmation. This is your call." V-Gans' gaze remained fixed on the labyrinth below. His mind replayed Syrah's words from their earlier meeting, the way her eyes had softened when she spoke of understanding him. He had scoffed at the notion then, but now with the weight of the city's expectations pressing down on him, the idea of being understood felt like a lifeline he couldn't afford to reach for. "Dr. Vasquez isn't just another enemy," he said finally, his tone low and clipped. "He's playing a game we don't fully understand. He's always 5 moves ahead." Riker's jaw tightened, a shadow crossing his eyes. "That's why we have to act now, before he makes the 6th. The silence that followed was heavy, not just with the burden of command, but with something more personal, shared history, old wounds that hadn't quite healed. Riker had been there the day Lane died, fighting by V-Gans' side when the mech collapsed and sealed their fate. The guilt was a silent third presence between them, never acknowledged but always felt. "Do you trust me?" V-Gan asked suddenly, turning to meet Riker's gaze. The question caught the captain off guard, his usually confident demeanor cracking as he searched V-Gans' eyes for the answer. Riker hesitated, the steel in his eyes softening, just enough to show the man beneath the uniform. "I trust what you used to be," he said, each word chosen with care. "I'm still trying to trust who you are now." The honesty was a punch to the gut, and V-Gans' chest tightened with a mix of frustration and gratitude. Before he could respond, the air crackled with the high-pitched whine of an approaching drone. Riker's head snapped up, eyes narrowing as he pulled a sleek black device from his belt, tapping into the feed. "It's Vasquez," he said, the tension in his voice tightening like a noose. "He's activated something." V-Gans' fists clenched at his sides, the muscles in his arms straining against the fabric of his suit. "Then we move," he said, stepping forward until the wind swallowed the rest of his words. "We end this now." The intrigue deepens. Sarah Elara stood in her office, the warmth of the morning sun now long forgotten, as she paced, phone pressed to her ear. The voice on the other end was calm, almost detached, but the words it spoke ignited a chill that crawled up her spine. "You were right to be worried. Vasquez has connections we didn't anticipate." "Who?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. The pause on the other end was unbearable. "The Spectre. They've been sighted at his lab. This changes everything." Syrah swallowed hard, memories of old case files flooding back. The Spectre was more than just a rogue operative. They were a phantom whose loyalty could turn the tide of any conflict. If Vasquez had them, it meant this wasn't just about revenge or power. It was about something deeper, something that threatened to unravel everything. Her gaze drifted to the skyline, where the sun had begun its descent, casting the city in shades of crimson and shadow. The fight that was coming wouldn't just be a battle of strength, but of minds and hearts, of loyalties tested and choices made in the heat of betrayal. And somewhere in that tangled web, V-Gan stood at the center, torn between the man he was and the man he feared he had become. Chapter 4. Dr. Vasquez's Gambit. The hum of machinery and the pulse of neon light cast the industrial sector in a perpetual state of twilight. Dr. Thorne Vasquez moved with precision through his labyrinthine lab, adjusting vials of bioluminescent liquid, each one containing a secret only he could decipher. He paused by the chamber that housed his creation, fingers splayed against the glass, eyes narrowing as he observed the barely perceptible stirrings of the entity within. It was not just a weapon, it was an evolution. A testament to his belief that science should not be restrained by ethics or morality. A sharp click of heels echoed in the distance. Vasquez's head lifted slightly, listening as the footsteps approached. The door opened to reveal a woman whose poise radiated authority. Her dark hair was pulled back into a severe bun, and her sharp eyes surveyed the room with the practiced air of someone who had seen worse and survived it. This was Major Eleanor Grant, a former military intelligence officer who had slipped into the private sector's murkier waters. "Eleanor," Vasquez drawled, a smile playing on his lips, "I didn't expect you so soon." Her eyes flickered to the chamber, and for a moment her stoic expression faltered. "This is what you've been promising. It doesn't look like much." Vasquez's smile widened, though it held no warmth. "Patience. You military types always want to see the bomb before it explodes." Elena's jaw tightened, but she said nothing, moving closer to inspect the monitors lining the walls. V-Gan and his allies are making moves. Our sources say Riker Stone is sniffing around, and that squirrel, Wesley, is getting too close for comfort. Vasquez's eyes darkened, and he turned away, waving a hand as if dismissing an insect. Let them play their little games. By the time they piece it all together, it will be too late. Elena's gaze shifted to the man, searching for cracks in his confidence. She had worked with ambitious men before, and they always fell to one of two things: hubris or betrayal. "And the Spectre?" she pressed. "Are they still on our side?" A flicker of irritation crossed Vasquez's features, but he masked it quickly. "The Spectre does what benefits the Spectre. For now, we align, but they're an investment I'm willing to lose if it means securing victory." Elena's lips twitched into the semblance of a smile. "Spoken like a true tactician. Just remember, Thorne, alliances in this game are as fragile as glass. One crack and everything shatters." Vasquez nodded absently, already lost in the glow of his monitors. "Then let's make sure we're holding the hammer." Riker's Gambit. Across the city, in the old barracks that had become a nexus of planning and desperation, Captain Riker Stone rubbed the bridge of his nose, fatigue etching lines into his skin. The maps pinned on the walls told a story of preparations, of long nights dissecting intelligence reports, and of a man determined to reclaim control of a city that felt like it was slipping through his fingers. Wesley Marks sat cross-legged on the table, thumbing through a tablet with a series of encrypted messages. The light from the screen cast shadows across his face, making his usually jovial expression uncharacteristically somber. "We've got another problem," he said, breaking the silence. Riker glanced up, the muscle in his jaw tightening. "Tell me it's not more sleeper cells." "No, but it's worse," Wesley said, meeting Riker's eyes. "It's Sarah." Riker's heart skipped, but he masked it with a grunt, turning back to the notes he'd been scribbling. "What about her?" Wesley hesitated, the weight of what he was about to say evident in the way his shoulders slumped. "She's been contacting someone outside the network. The encryption's good, but not good enough. I managed to trace a few fragments. She's been reaching out to an alias connected to Vasquez." Riker stood so quickly, his chair screeched against the floor. His eyes were steel, sharp enough to cut. "Are you sure?" "Certain," Wesley said, his voice tinged with regret. "I know she was close to Lane, but whatever this is, it's bigger than old loyalties." The room fell silent, the revelation hanging in the air like a poisonous fog. Riker's mind raced, memories of Sierra's calm, probing gaze, interlacing with suspicions that had been gnawing at him for weeks. Had she played them all, weaving herself into their trust with quiet precision, only to tear it apart when the moment was right? "I want eyes on her at all times," Riker said finally, the words heavy with reluctance. "But keep it subtle. If she's playing both sides, I need to know why." Wesley nodded, but the doubt in his eyes was unmistakable. Trust, once given, was a fragile thing, and in their line of work, it could be fatal. Sierra's dilemma. The soft click of her office door closing behind her felt louder than it should. Sierra Elara moved to her desk, her fingers trembling as she typed a code into her secure terminal. The screen flickered to life, displaying an encrypted chat that only she could access. Her eyes darted to the window, the city's neon lights casting kaleidoscopic patterns across her office. "Contact unknown. Status active." The message blinked at her like an accusation. She had to know. The lies she'd been telling herself for weeks were starting to unravel, and the secrets she held threatened to pull her under. Lane's voice haunted her at night, the memory of their last conversation echoing in the space between sleep and waking. "Don't trust him, Sarah. You'll regret it." But she had trusted him. And now, with Vasquez's plans inching closer to fruition, the line between trust and betrayal blurred into something unrecognizable. A ping broke her reverie, and the encrypted chat window updated. Unknown, the pieces are moving. When the time comes, will you? Sarah's chest tightened, the weight of her decision pressing against her ribs like a vice. She closed her eyes, Lane's face flashing in her mind. The city she had fought to understand, the people she had grown to care for, it all balanced on a razor's edge. With trembling fingers, she typed back, "Yes." The emerging conflict. The industrial sector pulsed with the rhythmic heartbeat of machine as Dr. Vasquez completed the final calibration. Elena Grant watched him, arms crossed and eyes narrowed, calculating the risks. She had made alliances before, and every one of them had come with a cost. This one was no different. "V-Gan will come," she said, her voice cutting through the mechanical hum. "You're ready for that?" Vasquez's smile was thin, almost cruel. "I'm counting on it." But behind his bravado, a sliver of doubt wormed its way through. He didn't fear V-Gan's strength, but something deeper. The man's capacity to inspire loyalty, even in those who had every reason to abandon him. It was that loyalty that could tip the scales, that could bring everything crashing down if Vasquez miscalculated. And in the shadows of the city, the Spectre watched them all, eyes keen, hands ready, allegiance a shifting tide. The game was just beginning, and every move threatened to topple the delicate balance between victory and annihilation. Chapter 5. The Spectre's Secrets. The room was dark, illuminated only by the soft glow of dozens of monitors displaying various feeds, street cameras, hidden surveillance in the industrial sector, and even high-up angles of the city's brightest towers. This was the Spectre's lair, a sanctum where secrets were currency and knowledge was power. The Spectre sat at the center of it all, clad in a suit that seemed to blur at the edges, shifting in hue as if trying to remain unseen even when exposed. To the world, the Spectre was a phantom, an enigma whispered about in the back rooms of power, mentioned only when no other name would suffice. But here, surrounded by the cacophony of silent screens and the hum of servers, the Spectre was only human, bound by motives as complex and twisted as the wires that sprawled across the floor. They removed the mask, revealing a face sharp with determination and haunted by memories. Few had seen this face, and even fewer had lived to tell of it. The Spectre's real name was Arik Hale, a name buried long ago beneath layers of deceit, loss, and betrayal. The path that led to this room, to this life, was one paved with choices that were neither simple nor clean. Arik's eyes flicked to the center monitor, displaying a live feed from Vasquez's lab. The biotechnologist was in deep discussion with Major Eleanor Grant, their movements precise, almost rehearsed. Vasquez's ambition was apparent, a fire that Arik knew too well. It was the same fire that had driven him once, before the mission, before the loss. He leaned back, the chair creaking softly beneath him. His mind wandered back to a time when he had stood beside Lane Patrick, both of them younger, more naive. Lane with his unwavering belief in the good of others, and Arik, who had seen too many shadows to trust the light. They had shared moments that most would have considered friendship, moments when Lane's optimism had almost convinced Arik that there was hope. Until the betrayal. Until the night Lane died and Arik learned the cost of loyalty. A sudden beeping snapped him from his thoughts. The monitor flashed red, an alert pinging the camera outside Sarah Elara's office. He watched as Wesley Marks emerged from the shadows, his face conflicted as he left Sarah's door. Arik's brow furrowed. Sarah had been reaching out, digging into places he hadn't anticipated. Her intelligence was undeniable, and it was that intelligence that made her dangerous. "Who are you, really?" he whispered to the still image of Sarah's face frozen on the screen. The curiosity in his voice was laced with something else, an edge of admiration perhaps, or wariness. There was more to her than met the eye, and Arik Hale didn't deal in half-truths. He needed to know the whole story, to understand the shape of this game before it tilted out of his control. Arik stood, the smooth fabric of his suit shifting into a darker hue as he moved. He needed answers, and the only way to get them was to step out of the shadows and into the fray. The Spectre's greatest weapon had always been anonymity, but now, for the first time in years, Arik Hale would risk exposure. Chapter 6. Tensions rise. The old barracks were alive with the restless energy of Riker's team. Maps rustled under hurried hands, voices spoke in clipped tones, and the air was thick with anticipation. In the center of it all, Captain Riker Stone stood like the eye of a storm, unmoving, watching as his people prepared for whatever chaos was coming. Sarah Elara entered the room, her calm demeanor masking the thrum of nerves in her chest. She had noticed the way Wesley had been watching her and the subtle shift in Riker's interactions. They were suspicious. They had every right to be, but she couldn't let them know the truth. Not yet. "Captain," she said, her voice cutting through the noise, "can I have a word?" Riker's eyes, hard and assessing, met hers. For a moment there was only silence, the tension between them palpable. "Make it quick," he said, gesturing for the room to clear out. Wesley shot Sarah a glance as he left, one that spoke of questions left unasked but not forgotten. When the door closed, Riker crossed his arms, the lines on his face deepening. "What is it, Sarah?" She stepped closer, forcing herself to meet his gaze without flinching. "I need you to trust me, Riker. There are things happening that you don't understand, things I can't explain right now. But if we're going to get through this, you need to believe that I'm on your side." Riker's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing. Trust is a dangerous word these days, especially when it's coming from someone who's been talking to shadows. Sarah's heart skipped, the accusation landing with a weight she hadn't expected. "You've been watching me." "I have to," he snapped, the edge in his voice sharp enough to cut. "Vasquez is playing a game we don't know the rules to, and you're moving pieces behind the scenes. Tell me why." The silence stretched, electric and suffocating. Sarah's mind raced, searching for an answer that wouldn't break everything she'd built with one lie too many. Finally, she spoke, her voice steady but laced with the ache of truth. "I knew Lane Riker, more than you think, and he knew Vasquez was dangerous even then. What I'm doing now, it's what he would have wanted." Riker's expression shifted, the mask of anger slipping to reveal something rawer. He had loved Lane like a brother, trusted him more than anyone. The mention of his name now felt like a wound torn open. "And what if you're wrong? What if all of this, whatever you're planning, gets us killed?" Sarah stepped even closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of grey in his eyes, the fatigue etched into his features. "Then I'll answer for it," she said, her voice soft but unyielding. "But I need you to trust that I'm doing this for him. For all of us." A knock interrupted them, the sharp rap, echoing like a gunshot. The door opened, and V-Gans stepped in, his expression unreadable, but his presence filling the room. His gaze flicked between the two of them, taking in Riker's clenched fists and Sarah's set jaw. "Am I interrupting?" he asked, the tension in his voice mirroring the room's atmosphere. "No," Riker said, stepping back, his eyes lingering on Sarah for a moment longer. "We're done here." V-Gan watched him leave before turning to Sarah. "What was that about?" Sarah hesitated, the weight of her secrets pressing against her like chains. "Just old ghosts," she said, forcing a smile. But V-Gan's eyes narrowed, the storm in them brewing once more. "Ghosts have a way of coming back," he said, his voice low. "Make sure you're ready when they do." And as he turned and walked away, Sarah knew that the path ahead would demand more than just courage. It would demand the truth, and that was something she wasn't sure she was ready to face. Chapter 7. The Hero's Descent. The sky above Verde Heights was dark, a canvas of storm clouds that promised thunder but held back its wrath. V-Gan stood on the edge of the industrial sector, the maze of metal and rust stretching out before him like a wound in the heart of the city. The air was heavy with the acrid scent of machinery and oil, sharp and unwelcoming. He took a deep breath, the weight of his own doubts pressing down harder than the wind that tugged at his tattered green cape. Lane's voice echoed in his mind, fragmented memories replaying in the quiet moments between battles. "Remember why you fight, not just who you're fighting against." The words felt distant now, buried under layers of grief, anger, and guilt. What did Lane know of the choices he'd had to make since that day? Choices that blurred the line between hero and monster. He clenched his fists, the tension in his body coiling tight as if ready to snap. He was no stranger to violence, but tonight felt different. Tonight, the battle was not just with the villain lurking in the shadows, but with himself. The scrape of metal on concrete pulled him from his thoughts. V-Gans' eyes sharpened, narrowing as a figure stepped from the dark alleyways. Dr. Thorne Vasquez, his silhouette backlit by the sickly green glow of the pipes that lined the sector, moved with an elegance that belied his monstrous ambitions. His white coat fluttered slightly, stained with the residue of his experiments, and his eyes glinted with a mix of curiosity and disdain. "Well, well," Vasquez said, his voice dripping with mock amusement. "The great protector graces my humble corner of the world. To what do I owe the honor, V-Gan?" V-Gan's jaw tightened, every muscle in his body coiled and ready. "You know why I'm here, Thorne. This ends tonight." Vasquez's lips curved into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Ah, but that's where you're wrong. Tonight isn't the end. It's merely the beginning. You see, I've learned something about you, something fascinating." V-Gan's heart thudded against his ribs, but he kept his expression neutral. "Spare me your monologues, Vasquez." "Indulge me," Vasquez countered, stepping closer, the lights casting sharp shadows across his gaunt features. "Do you remember the day Lane Patrick died? Of course you do. The guilt radiates off you like heat. But did you ever wonder if things could have been different? If there was another way?" V-Gan's composure cracked, if only for a moment, the ghost of Lane's final moments clawing at his mind. The weight of Vasquez's words struck harder than any physical blow. "What are you trying to say?" he growled, voice low and dangerous. Vasquez's eyes sparkled with triumph. "I'm saying that Lane's death wasn't an accident, and it wasn't just your failure." He leaned in, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "He was betrayed, V-Gan, by someone you trusted." The world tilted, the sounds around him dulling to a distant hum. V-Gan's vision narrowed, his pulse roaring in his ears. He forced himself to breathe, to lock eyes with the man whose words threatened to dismantle him piece by piece. "Who?" he demanded, the word barely more than a growl. Vasquez tilted his head, the smirk returning. "Now, that would be telling. But know this, hero. Trust is a fragile thing, and yours has been misplaced for a long time." Before V-Gan could react, Vasquez's hand flicked, pressing a hidden button on his wrist. The pipes overhead erupted with a hiss, and the air was suddenly filled with the acrid smell of gas. Vasquez stepped back, his silhouette blurring as smoke coiled between them. "Consider this your warning," Vasquez's voice called out from somewhere in the dark, "before the real storm begins." V-Gan lunged forward, the smoke stinging his eyes, but Vasquez was already gone, swallowed by the maze of pipes and shadows. He stood there, chest heaving, fists shaking as the echoes of Vasquez's words burrowed into his mind like barbed wire. The shattered psyche. Hours later, the rooftop of the old police barracks was where V-Gan found himself, seeking solace from the chaos below. The city lights stretched out beneath him, glittering like scattered embers, oblivious to the war waging above. He leaned against the ledge, the cool wind biting at his face, eyes locked on the horizon where the industrial sector still smoldered. Riker's footsteps echoed up the metal staircase, sharp and deliberate. V-Gan didn't need to look to know who it was. The captain's presence was always a mix of defiance and loyalty, a storm ready to clash or defend at a moment's notice. "You found him," Riker said, voice tight with frustration, but he slipped away, again. V-Gan's silence was answer enough. Riker moved closer, his gaze cutting through the dark, to find V-Gan's profile, tense and unreadable. "What happened down there?" V-Gan exhaled, the sound heavy with the weight of unspoken truths. "He knows more than he should. About Lane. About that night." Riker's face hardened, old memories reflected in the steel of his eyes. "And what did he tell you?" "That Lane's death wasn't an accident. That someone betrayed us," V-Gan said, each word a stone dropping into a well of doubt. Riker's jaw clenched, a muscle twitching as he processed the revelation. "Do you believe him?" Silence fell between them, the question hanging like smoke. Did he believe Vasquez? The man was a master manipulator, a puppet master pulling strings in the dark. But there was a ring of truth to his words, a resonance that matched the whisperings of doubt that had haunted V-Gan for years. "I don't know," V-Gan admitted, his voice rough. "But if he's right—" Riker turned away, his fists clenching as he struggled with the implications. "If he's right, then this is bigger than Vasquez. It's bigger than any of us." The wind howled, as if echoing their fears. They stood side by side, two soldiers in a battle that had begun long before they realized it. And beneath the weight of that silence, V-Gan felt the foundation of his trust begin to crack. The turning point. Back in her office, Sarah Elara sat in the dark, the screen of her secure terminal casting a harsh glow on her face. Her conversation with Riker replayed in her mind, his suspicion digging at her resolve like claws. The encrypted chat on her screen blinked, a new message appearing. "Unknown, the hero is faltering. Are you prepared to do what's necessary?" Her hand trembled as she typed back, the decision already made before she could question it. "Yes." In the shadows of the city, the pieces shifted, and the true battle began, not one of strength or weapons, but of trust, betrayal, and the truths that could shatter them all. Chapter 8. The Depths of Doubt. The rooftop of the old police barracks was quiet, save for the rhythmic pounding of the wind as it swept over the city. V-Gan stood still, the words Vasquez had spoken echoing in his mind, carving deep channels of doubt that threatened to erode the core of who he believed he was. The hero's heartbeat thudded against his chest, uneven and urgent, each beat underscoring the newfound uncertainty that settled in his bones. He was betrayed, V-Gan, by someone you trusted. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to banish the memory, but it came back with a vengeance. Images of Lane Patrick, his friend, and the unwavering anchor of his principles flashed before him. Lane's laughter, his eyes lit with conviction as he spoke of justice, of hope, of never giving in to despair. Moments that felt so pure they were almost sacred. But now that purity felt tainted, touched by an unseen darkness that made V-Gan's skin crawl. What if Vasquez is right? What if the betrayal came from within? The question ate at him, gnawed at the edges of his sanity. It was more than the idea of betrayal. It was the notion that he had missed it, that he had been blind to the rot growing within his circle. The night Lane died played in his mind like a broken record. Chaos, the metallic groan of the mech collapsing, Lane's body trapped beneath unforgiving debris, the last look they shared before the light in Lane's eyes faded. V-Gan's chest tightened, the weight of that memory suffocating him. Damn it! The roar tore from his throat, raw and primal. He slammed his fist into the brick ledge, the stone cracking under the force, shards tumbling into the dark alley below. The physical pain was a small, fleeting reprieve from the ache that gnawed at his heart. The rooftop door opened behind him, hinges squealing in protest. He didn't need to turn to know who it was. Sarah Elara's presence was distinct, calm, analytical, and quietly persistent. Her footsteps were soft as she approached, stopping just shy of the broken ledge. "V-Gan," she said, her voice measured but not devoid of warmth. She was trying to reach him, to pull him back from the edge, but the space between them felt vast. "What do you want, Sarah?" he asked, his tone harsher than he intended. The guilt of it gnawed at him immediately, but he kept his eyes on the city, unable to face her. "I want to know what happened tonight," she said, not moving closer, giving him space to breathe, to think. "Riker told me Vasquez got inside your head." He laughed, short and bitter. "He did more than that. He cracked it open." Silence settled between them, thick and suffocating. Sarah's eyes softened as she watched him, taking in the tension coiled through his frame, the weariness in his slumped shoulders. She had seen this before in others, heroes who carried the weight of failure like a scar on their souls. "I'm not here to pry, V-Gan," she said finally. "I'm here because I know what it's like to lose someone and not have the answers." Her words cut through the fog in his mind, sharpening his attention. He turned to look at her, the storm in his eyes meeting the steady calm of hers. "And what did you do when that happened?" he asked, the question carrying more weight than he intended. Sarah's lips tightened, her fingers flexing at her sides. "I searched until the truth nearly destroyed me," she said, the confession slipping out like a reluctant sigh. "And then I rebuilt myself from the pieces it left behind." V-Gan's gaze held hers, searching for any sign of deceit, but all he found was a reflection of the pain he carried. For the first time in what felt like ages, the hard shell around him cracked just a little. But it was enough for doubt to creep in, not only in Vasquez's words, but in what he didn't know about Sarah. "What are you hiding, Sarah?" he whispered. The question more to himself than to her, but she heard it, and her eyes flickered with something he couldn't quite name. Fear, regret, maybe both. "I'm not the enemy, V-Gan," she said, and this time there was a note of desperation in her voice. "But I'm not innocent either." Before he could press her, the sound of footsteps echoed up the stairwell, and Riker appeared, eyes sharp and scanning. The captain's presence brought an immediate shift to the atmosphere, the vulnerable thread between V-Gan and Sarah snapping back into the armor of professionalism. "We've got movement," Riker said, his gaze shifting between them. "Vasquez's lab. Wesley picked up chatter about a test run. We need to move now." V-Gan nodded, already pulling himself back into the role that demanded strength and resolve, even when he felt neither. But as he moved past Sarah, he caught the briefest glimpse of guilt in her eyes. It settled in his gut like a stone, heavy and foreboding. Chapter 9. Hidden Connections. Sarah Elara sat alone in her dimly lit office, the glow from her terminal casting a cold light across her features. The encrypted chat flashed on the screen, waiting for her response. She hesitated, fingers poised above the keys, memories clawing at the edges of her mind. Lane's smile, the warmth in his eyes as he spoke of hope, the last time she saw him alive. Her vision blurred as the past came rushing back, unbidden. The first time she met Dr. Thorne. Vasquez had been at a research summit. Lane had introduced them, his voice full of admiration for Vasquez's work. "Brilliant, isn't he?" Lane had said, a grin splitting his face. "But there's something about him, Sarah. Something I can't quite put my finger on." She should have listened to that instinct, should have seen the ambition simmering beneath Vasquez's charm, the way he spoke of science as if it were a deity he intended to command. But she hadn't, and Lane had paid the price. The chat blinked again, demanding her attention. "Unknown, you're stalling. If you want the truth, you need to act." Her fingers moved before she could second-guess herself. "Sarah, I need proof. What happened that night?" The response was almost immediate, as if whoever was on the other end had been waiting. "Unknown, meet me where it began. Midnight." Sarah's heart thundered in her chest, the place where it all began. The old observatory on the edge of the city, where Lane had taken her to show her the stars, to talk about dreams that now seemed so far away. She closed the chat and leaned back, the weight of her decision pressing down like a suffocating blanket. A creak at the door made her jump, and she turned to see Wesley standing there, his expression unreadable. "You were close to Lane, weren't you?" he asked, his voice quiet, almost gentle. She swallowed, unable to lie. "Yes, closer than anyone knew." Wesley stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "Then you should know something. Vasquez isn't just after V-Gan, he's after you too." Sarah's breath caught, the room spinning around her as the implications settled in. Vasquez's words, V-Gan's doubts, her own secrets. They were all leading to one inevitable confrontation. And when that moment came, the truth would shatter more than just trust. It would break them all. Chapter 10. The Observatory's Echoes. The observatory loomed on the edge of Verde Heights, half forgotten and shrouded in darkness. Once a place of wonder where the city's residents gathered to look at the stars, it now stood as a relic of past dreams, draped in ivy and silence. The night was cool, the air thick with the scent of rain that had yet to fall, and the city below hummed with oblivious life. Sarah Elara stood at the cracked marble steps, her breath shallow and her nerves taut. The memories of the past clawed at her, Lane's laughter echoing in her ears, drawing her back to simpler times when life had seemed full of promise. But those memories were poisoned now, tainted by the shadow of betrayal and secrets she had spent years burying. The sound of footsteps, soft and deliberate, pulled her from her reverie. She turned, eyes straining in the dark, until a figure emerged from the shadows. The spectre. Their suit melded with the dark, absorbing the weak light of the distant street lamps, and the mask they wore revealed nothing but sharp, watchful eyes. "You came," the spectre said, voice low and unreadable. It was more a statement than a question, as if they had never doubted she would. Sarah's pulse quickened. She had dealt with dangerous people before, but the spectre was different. They were more than a phantom. They were a reminder of everything she had lost and everything she still feared to lose. "You said you had proof," she said, keeping her voice steady despite the tremor that threatened to slip through. The spectre tilted their head, studying her for a moment that stretched into an uncomfortable silence. Then, with a fluid motion, they reached into their suit and pulled out a small, worn notebook. The sight of it sent a chill through Sarah's veins. She knew that notebook, knew the scrawl on its pages. It was Lane's, filled with notes from their late-night talks, plans for the future, and musings that had kept them up under the observatory's dome. "Where did you get this?" she whispered, stepping forward before catching herself, forcing her feet to stay rooted in place. The spectre's eyes flickered with something close to sympathy, but it was gone in an instant. "Lane trusted the wrong person, Dr. Ilara. That night wasn't just an accident. It was orchestrated, manipulated from within." Sarah's breath hitched as the weight of the spectre's words settled over her like a lead blanket. She reached for the notebook, her fingers brushing the leather cover, worn from Lane's touch. The pages crinkled as she flipped through them, her eyes skimming the familiar handwriting until she found it. A series of notes that detailed a suspicion Lane had confided in her just days before his death. "Vasquez is brilliant, but I'm beginning to think he's not working alone. There's another voice guiding him, one hidden but powerful. I need to talk to Sarah about this, but I fear for what it means if I'm right." Sarah's vision blurred with unshed tears. Lane had known more than he let on. He had suspected the betrayal that had led to his death. But the question that twisted in her gut, sharp and unrelenting, was who that hidden voice belonged to. "Why show me this now?" she demanded, snapping the notebook shut and glaring at the spectre. "What do you stand to gain?" The spectre's gaze was unflinching. "Because the pieces are moving faster than you think. Vasquez isn't the only one playing this game, and if you want to survive, you need to know who your real enemies are." Before Sarah could respond, a sound, soft but unmistakable, echoed from behind her. The click of a gun being cocked. She froze, heart pounding, as she slowly turned to see Captain Riker Stone emerging from the shadows, his gun trained on the spectre. "Step away, Sarah," Riker said, his eyes locked on the spectre with a lethal intensity that left no room for negotiation. "This ends now." The spectre didn't flinch, their hands lifting slightly, palms open in a gesture of compliance. But their eyes met Sarah's one last time, silently communicating a warning or perhaps an apology. "Riker, put the gun down," Sarah said, her voice shaking. She moved between them, her back to the spectre. "You don't understand. There's more going on here than you realize." "Move, Sarah," Riker snapped, his voice low and controlled, but laced with the desperation of a man who had reached his limit. "I can't let this go any further." "I won't," she insisted, planting her feet and holding his gaze. "If you trust me at all, you'll let me handle this." The silence that followed was a battlefield in itself, filled with unspoken doubts and the weight of past loyalties. Riker's finger twitched on the trigger, and for a heartbeat, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then the spectre moved, swift and silent, grabbing Sarah by the arm and spinning her out of the line of fire as a shot rang out. The bullet struck the stone wall, splintering marble and sending shards scattering into the night. Riker cursed, adjusting his aim, but the spectre was already gone, vanished into the darkness as if they had never been there. Sarah staggered back, her heart racing, eyes wide with shock. Riker lowered the gun, breathing heavily as he stepped toward her, his expression unreadable. "What the hell just happened?" he demanded, voice ragged. She met his eyes, the notebook clutched tightly in her hand. "The truth," she whispered, voice trembling. "It's starting to come out." Chapter 11, Revelations and Fractures. The city pulsed with the electric hum of anticipation as midnight deepened into the early hours. Verde Heights was restless, its air charged with the tension that comes before a storm. Within the old police barracks, Sarah Elara sat in a chair that felt harder than stone, the dim glow of the desk lamp casting deep shadows across her face. She held Lane's worn notebook in her lap, its familiar pages now burdened with meaning that threatened to unravel everything. V-Gan and Riker stood across from her, their eyes reflecting the same exhaustion and wariness that clung to the room like a shroud. Riker paced, his boots thudding against the concrete floor with each sharp turn. V-Gan remained motionless, his gaze fixed on Sarah, waiting for her to speak. "You said Vasquez mentioned betrayal," Sarah began, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. She opened the notebook, fingers tracing Lane's handwriting. He was right. Lane knew there was someone else involved, someone orchestrating everything from the shadows. Riker stopped pacing, his jaw tightening as the implications sank in. "Who?" he demanded, his voice edged with the frustration of too many unanswered questions. Sarah looked up at them, eyes flicking between the two men she had come to rely on in different ways. V-Gan's expression was unreadable, the muscles in his jaw clenched so tight she thought they might crack. "I don't know yet," she admitted, swallowing against the fear that her confession would break their fragile alliance. "But I believe it's someone connected to Vasquez, and possibly even within our ranks." Riker's eyes darkened, and he took a step forward, hands fisting at his sides. "You've been keeping this from us, Sarah, all this time, and you knew Lane suspected something." "I didn't know enough," she shot back, her voice sharper now, the guilt and exhaustion stripping away her usual calm. "And every step closer to the truth felt like another risk that could get us all killed. I couldn't share what I wasn't sure of." "Until tonight," V-Gan said, finally speaking. His voice was low, the words weighted with an emotion that cut through the tension like a blade. "When the Spectre showed up with proof." Sarah nodded, unable to meet his eyes. "Yes, and if Vasquez knows we're this close, he'll make his next move soon." V-Gan turned to Riker, the captain's eyes meeting his in a silent exchange that spoke of years of camaraderie and shared battles. "We need to bring this to the team," V-Gan said, a decision forming in his mind as he spoke. "Everyone needs to know what we're dealing with." Riker's lips pressed into a thin line. "And what if this breaks us? If someone within our ranks is compromised, revealing this could tip them off." "Then we act fast," V-Gan replied, the resolve in his voice steadying the room. "We use this to draw them out before Vasquez can." Sarah watched them, the weight of her secret pressing down like a stone in her chest. She had trusted Lane, and now she would have to trust them, but trust was a fragile thing, and in the world they lived in, it could splinter like glass. Vasquez's fury. In the heart of the industrial sector, the glow of Vasquez's lab cast an otherworldly pallor across his face. He stood at the console, eyes darting over the data streaming across the screen, muscles in his jaw ticking as he absorbed the latest report. The Spectre had shifted. They had broken ranks, revealed themselves in a way that suggested an unexpected allegiance. "Damn you, Arik," he muttered, the name tasting like bile on his tongue. His mind raced through contingencies, recalibrating plans that had seemed foolproof just hours before. He was brilliant, yes, but brilliance was no match for betrayal from someone who knew the depths of his mind. Elena Grant entered the room, her movements precise, eyes sharp as they took in the controlled chaos. "We have a problem," she said, her voice clipped professional. "The Spectre's actions have thrown our timeline off. V-Gan's team is mobilizing." Vasquez slammed a fist onto the console, the impact echoing like a gunshot. The chamber at the center of the lab vibrated, its occupants stirring as if sensing the rage that fueled the room. "We proceed as planned," he said, the words a growl. "No more waiting. Let them come." Elena arched an eyebrow, a smirk playing at the corner of her lips. "You're not worried they'll figure out the rest? That Sarah might know more than she's letting on?" Vasquez's eyes met hers, cold and unyielding. "Worried? No, I'm counting on it. This game isn't about survival anymore, Major. It's about conquest." The room hummed with the anticipation of what was to come, the air heavy with the knowledge that the first move had already been made, and the next would shatter everything. The trust test. Wesley Marks leaned against the wall of the war room, eyes darting over the faces of the team gathered around. V-Gan stood at the head, Sarah just behind him, and Riker to his right. The room was filled with allies, those who had stood by them in battles past, each carrying scars of loyalty that ran deep. But now the air crackled with suspicion, an unspoken question lingering in every corner. Who could be trusted? V-Gan cleared his throat, the low rumble silencing the murmurs. We're here because we can't afford secrets. Lane Patrick died because of one, and we're not making that mistake again." Eyes turned to Sarah, some with curiosity, others with thinly veiled suspicion. She stepped forward, the notebook clutched in her hand. Lane knew there was someone working against us from within. He didn't know who, but he was close to finding out before he died. "I have reason to believe Vasquez's current plan isn't just his own. He's being directed, influenced by someone who knows us, someone who has access." Wesley's eyes widened, and he pushed off the wall, hands spread in mock protest. "Are you saying one of us is playing for the other side?" A murmur of disbelief swept through the room, but it died when Riker spoke. "If that's true, we need to find out who before it's too late." The room fell into a tense silence as V-Gans' gaze swept over them all. "We need to put trust to the test. We work as one, eyes open, and we don't let anything slip through the cracks." Wesley's smirk faded, his usual bravado giving way to something more serious. "And what if we find out we've been trusting the wrong person?" V-Gan met his eyes, the storm in his own dark and unforgiving. "Then we do what we must." The words echoed in the room, a promise, a warning, and a reminder that even among heroes, trust was the most dangerous weapon of all. Chapter 12. Truths Unraveled. The war room had emptied, the echoes of the meeting's tension lingering like ghosts in the dim light. Sarah remained behind, her hands gripping Lane's notebook so tightly her knuckles whitened. The room felt cavernous now, its silence magnifying the heartbeat pounding in her ears. She sensed V-Gan's presence before she saw him. The air shifted, heavy with the energy he carried. "You waited," he said, stepping into the room, his voice low and guarded. He didn't look at her immediately, eyes scanning the remnants of their meeting, scattered notes, maps with lines crisscrossed in red. Finally he turned, the weight of his gaze landing squarely on her. "Why?" Sarah exhaled, the sound tremulous in the stillness. "Because you need to know the truth. About Lane, about Vasquez, and about me." V-Gan's eyes flickered with a mix of curiosity and something sharper, a wariness that had grown over time. He stepped closer, the space between them shrinking until the tension became palpable. "Then tell me, Sarah, no more half-truths." The words cut her, but she nodded, turning Lane's notebook in her hands before placing it on the table between them. The leather cover felt warm, almost alive, as if Lane's spirit lingered in every word it held. She met V-Gan's gaze, searching for understanding or anger. Anything to anchor her in the storm that was about to break. "I met Lane when I first started my career in trauma psychology," she began, her voice steady but soft. "He was already working with community programs, using his influence to reach out to those who had been forgotten by the system. He brought me in to consult on a project aimed at helping veterans and first responders deal with PTSD. V-Gan's brow furrowed, a flicker of recognition in his eyes. "I remember. He spoke about that project often." Sarah nodded, a sad smile tugging at her lips. "We became close, closer than I expected. He was so full of hope, so relentless in his pursuit of justice, not just for the city but for every person who couldn't fight for themselves." Her voice caught, and she swallowed hard, eyes dropping to the notebook. "But it was during that project that we met Thorne Vasquez." V-Gan's expression hardened at the mention of Vasquez's name, the lines around his mouth deepening. "He was involved even back then?" "Yes," Sarah said, lifting her eyes to meet his. "He was different then, more charismatic, less corrupted. Lane was fascinated by his work, by the potential to use technology to heal. But I saw something else, a hunger in Vasquez, an ambition that didn't align with Lane's vision. I told Lane, but he thought he could control it, direct it towards something good." "And he failed," V-Gan said, the accusation heavy in the air. "He didn't fail," Sarah corrected, her voice fierce. "He trusted the wrong person. Vasquez's brilliance was matched only by his ability to deceive. He gained Lane's trust and mine, until it was too late." V-Gan took a step back, the storm in his eyes darkening as he processed her words. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" he asked, voice low and edged with betrayal. "Why keep this hidden?" Sarah's hands trembled, and she gripped the edge of the table to steady them. Because after Lane died, I didn't know who to trust. Vasquez made it clear that anyone who got in his way would pay the price. I needed to stay close to him, to gather proof, to make sure that when the time came, we could end this for good. Close? The word hung between them, charged with meaning. V-Gans' expression shifted, anger and something more painful crossing his face. How close, Sarah? She met his eyes, refusing to look away, even as the truth threatened to break her. Close enough to understand him, to know that he wouldn't stop at Lane, that he saw all of us as pawns in his game. But I never aligned with him, V-Gan. I stayed because it was the only way to learn what he planned. He looked away, jaw clenched so tightly she thought he might crack a tooth. The room seemed smaller now, the walls pressing in, filled with the weight of everything unsaid. "And what about now?" he asked finally, his voice softer, raw. "Are you still playing both sides?" "No," she said, stepping forward, closing the space between them until she could feel the heat of his anger and doubt. "I'm here now because Lane believed in you. And because I do too." His eyes met hers, the storm slowly ebbing as something softer, more vulnerable flickered to life. For a moment they stood in silence, the room a fragile sanctuary holding their truths. Then he reached for the notebook, his fingers brushing hers as he took it. "If you're lying to me, Sarah," he said, the warning clear but tinged with hope, "it won't just be Vasquez you have to answer to." She nodded, a tear escaping down her cheek, unbidden and unnoticed. "I know," she whispered, and for the first time in years she felt the weight of her secrets begin to lift, if only slightly. Chapter 13. The Machinations of Dr. Vasquez. The industrial sector of Verde Heights buzzed with the low, ceaseless hum of machinery and the crackle of power coursing through hidden conduits. In the center of it all, Dr. Thorne Vasquez stood like the conductor of an orchestra only he could hear. The glow from monitors cast deep shadows across his face, accentuating the sharp lines of a man driven by a singular, relentless ambition. He scrolled through the latest data on a sleek touchpad, his mind racing faster than the information flashing before him. Reports of Sarah's encounter with the Spectre, intercepted communications from Riker's war room, and the surveillance footage of V-Gans' pensive return to their base. All of it pieced together like a puzzle with missing edges. The door to the lab slid open with a mechanical hiss, and Major Eleanor Grant stepped inside, her boots striking the metal floor with an authoritative rhythm. Her gaze swept the room, landing on Vasquez with the precision of a trained operative. "You've lost the Spectre," she said without preamble, crossing her arms. The hard set of her mouth showed she wasn't here for excuses. Vasquez smirked, the expression sharp and humorless. "I haven't lost anything, Major. I merely allowed them to show their true colors." "Is that what you're calling it?" Elena's tone was icy, the challenge clear. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like your plan is starting to fall apart." He set the touchpad down, his fingers steepling in front of him as he regarded her with a cool detachment. "You doubt my control, Eleanor. That's dangerous." She didn't flinch, meeting his gaze with her own steely resolve. "I'm not here to stroke your ego, Thorne. I'm here to remind you that we're running out of time. V-Gans' team is already mobilizing, and Sarah Elara knows more than you gave her credit for. We need to accelerate the timeline." Vasquez's eyes darkened, and he stood, the movement fluid and calculated. He walked past Eleanor, stopping before the large chamber at the center of the room. The figure suspended within shifted slightly, the neon green liquid casting a sickly glow that made its silhouette appear monstrous. "The time for waiting is over," he said, voice low but carrying the weight of a command. "If they think they've uncovered the truth, then we give them what they're looking for. But on my terms." Elena's brows lifted, the only indication of her surprise. "And how do you plan to do that?" A smile, sharp and full of intent, tugged at his lips. "We show them what they fear most, the cracks in their precious trust. Syrah's connection to me isn't just a liability, it's an opportunity. V-Gan is already questioning her, doubting what she represents. We use that. We feed it until it fractures their unity." He turned back to his touchpad, fingers flying over the screen as he activated a series of commands. On a nearby monitor, a map of the city lit up with a dozen red markers, each one representing a dormant asset or a planted agent, ready to act at a moment's notice. "Initiate Phase Delta," he said, glancing at Eleanor. "Deploy the operatives to key positions. I want chaos on every corner of Verde Heights by tomorrow night." Elena's eyes flicked to the monitors, her expression unreadable. "You're risking a lot with this move, Thorne. If it fails—" "It won't fail," he interrupted, his voice steely and cold. "By the time they realize what's happening, it will be too late. They'll turn on each other, and when they're weakened, we strike." A soft chime interrupted them, and Vasquez's eyes shifted to the leftmost monitor. A live feed from one of the underground hideouts showed the Spectre speaking to someone off-camera, their body language tense, almost anxious. A spark of irritation flared in Vasquez's chest, but he quelled it, leaning closer as the audio crackled to life. "They don't know yet, but they're close," the Spectre's voice said, low and urgent. "Vasquez is moving faster than we anticipated. We need to be ready." Vasquez's mouth twisted into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He straightened, switching off the feed with a flick of his fingers. "Good," he murmured to himself. "Let them scramble. Let them try." Elena watched him, her eyes narrowing as she absorbed the edge in his tone. "And what about the Spectre? If they're working against you, they're a threat." Vasquez chuckled, a dark sound that reverberated through the room. "The Spectre is many things, but they are predictable. They act out of self-preservation, and soon they will find that there's nowhere to run where I can't find them." He turned back to the chamber, the shadow within shifting again, a grotesque mimicry of life. "Prepare for the release sequence," he commanded, his voice a mixture of anticipation and menace. "We're going to show them all that the game has only just begun." Elena nodded, her eyes glinting with the thrill of what was to come. "It will be done." As she left, Vasquez stood alone, the hum of the lab deepening into a growl as the machinery prepared for the next phase. His mind spun with plans within plans, traps within traps. He had come too far to lose now, and he would burn the city to its foundations before he let hope defeat him again. A calculated move. In a hidden basement beneath an old bookstore, the Spectre paced, their mind racing with the implications of Vasquez's accelerated plans. The room was cluttered with old maps, surveillance photos, and hastily scribbled notes, each one a piece of the puzzle that threatened to destroy them all. A soft knock at the door pulled them from their thoughts, and they turned, body tensed for an attack. The door opened a crack, and a familiar face peered in. Wesley Marks stepped inside, his usual smirk absent, replaced by an expression of grim determination. "We need to talk," he said, shutting the door behind him. The Spectre nodded, removing their mask and revealing the face of Arik Hale. His eyes, usually unreadable, flashed with something close to vulnerability. "Does V-Gan know you're here?" Wesley shook his head, moving to the table and glancing at the chaos spread across it. "No, and he can't. Not yet." His gaze shifted to Arik, suspicion mingled with trust. "What's your angle, Hale? Why risk coming back now, after all this time?" Arik's jaw clenched, a muscle ticking as he considered the question. "Because Vasquez isn't just after control, he's after revenge. And if we don't stop him, there won't be a team left to save." Wesley's eyes narrowed, the weight of his loyalty and doubt pressing down on him. "Then we do this together," he said, voice low. "But if you're playing us, I'll make sure you regret it." A ghost of a smile tugged at Arik's lips. "Understood." And with that, the pieces began to shift once more, each one set on a path that could either shatter or save them all. Chapter 14. The Gathering Storm. The war room in the old police barracks buzzed with nervous energy as the team assembled. Maps of Verde Heights were pinned up on every available surface, marked with red and blue pins representing suspected threats and known allies. The overhead lights flickered as if reacting to the tension that thickened the air. V-Gans stood at the center, his expression a mask of determination, hiding the tempest that Vasquez's revelation had stirred within him. Riker was to his right, arms crossed and eyes sharp, scanning the room as if daring anyone to show a hint of hesitation. Wesley Marks lounged at the edge of the table, fingers drumming an erratic beat that betrayed his usual bravado. Sarah Elara sat closest to the map, Lane's notebook open in front of her, pages splayed like a silent witness to the truths they were only beginning to grasp. The room fell silent as V-Gan cleared his throat, his gaze sweeping over them, taking in the faces that had fought by his side and those that had only recently joined their ranks. "Vasquez is making his move," he began, voice steady but laced with urgency. "The Spectre's intel confirmed what we feared. There's someone orchestrating this chaos from within, and we need to figure out who before we're dismantled from the inside." A murmur rippled through the group. Riker uncrossed his arms, stepping forward. "We need to identify every operative Vasquez has in the city. We have reports of sudden movements in key areas, places he'd target to destabilize us." He pointed to several red pins on the map, eyes narrowed. "Here, here, and here. Power stations, supply hubs, and comm towers. He's cutting us off at the knees." Wesley's fingers stilled, and he leaned in. "We're spread too thin to guard all those points," he said, a rare seriousness flattening his tone. "And if Vasquez has agents embedded in our network, we'll be reacting to their moves after it's too late." V-Gan nodded. "That's why we don't defend. We strike first." The room tensed, eyes widening at the unexpected strategy. "We hit his most critical asset, the lab. If we can take out his base of operations, we throw him off balance and force his hand." Sarah glanced up from Lane's notebook, her eyes searching V-Gans for the man she hoped was still there. "That's risky," she said, her voice soft but insistent. "If we're wrong about the lab being the central hub, we'll lose the advantage we still have." Riker's gaze flicked to Sarah, a muscle in his jaw tightening. "We don't have the luxury of waiting, Sarah. Vasquez is counting on our hesitation." Wesley tilted his head, his eyes darting between the others. "What if we're being baited? Vasquez is smart enough to know we'd target the lab. He could be leading us straight into a trap." V-Gan's eyes darkened, the weight of leadership pressing down like an iron fist. "Then we adapt. If we don't move now, we're giving him the chance to complete whatever he's planning. I won't let this city fall because we hesitated." A sudden knock on the door silenced them. A young agent, barely out of training, stepped in, her face pale. "Sir, we have reports coming in. Explosions at the northern comm tower and power fluctuations at the southern grid." Riker cursed under his breath, turning to V-Gan. "It's starting." The room erupted into motion, chairs scraping back and agents grabbing weapons and gear. Sarah stood, her eyes fixed on V-Gan. "If we're going into the lion's den, we need to be prepared for whatever he throws at us," she said. She hesitated, then added, "And that means knowing who we can trust." V-Gan's eyes met hers, a silent agreement passing between them. "Wesley, you're with me. We're hitting the lab. Riker, take your team and secure the comm towers. Sarah," his voice softened, "I need you here, coordinating intel. If Vasquez moves again, we need to know before it happens." Sarah's eyes flashed with a mixture of relief and frustration. She nodded, fingers brushing over Lane's notebook, a silent promise to see this through to the end. "I'll do my part," she said, the determination in her voice a thin veil over the fear that coiled in her gut. Wesley slung his gear over his shoulder, a smirk playing at the corner of his lips. "Looks like we're storming the gates of hell, boss," he said, clapping V-Gan on the back. "Let's make sure we come out with more than just stories." The room emptied quickly, the tension replaced by the focused energy of people ready to fight for their city. V-Gan paused at the door, glancing back at Sarah one last time. The shadows of their unspoken truths stretched between them, but there was no time left for anything more. "Stay safe," he said, his voice a rough whisper. "You too," Sarah replied, watching as he disappeared into the hall, the echoes of his footsteps swallowed by the roar of their battle plans. The unseen trap. Dr. Thorne Vasquez stood in his lab, eyes fixed on the monitors that showed the movements of V-Gan's team. His lips curved into a smile that was all teeth and menace. "You're coming right to me," he murmured, fingers tapping out a command that sent a signal to his embedded operatives. The figure in the chamber behind him stirred, a low guttural sound vibrating through the room. Vasquez turned, eyes gleaming with anticipation. "Soon," he said, more to himself than to the entity behind the glass. "Let them think they've found victory, and when they see what true power looks like, they'll beg for mercy." Elena Grant entered, her eyes sweeping over the scene. "It's ready," she said, voice steady but laced with the same dark excitement that Vasquez carried. Vasquez nodded, not taking his eyes off the chamber. "Good. Activate the secondary protocols. I want them to see what betrayal truly means." As the lights in the lab shifted, casting everything in hues of red and gold, Vasquez felt the pulse of control thrumming through him. This was more than conquest. It was retribution. And soon, Verde Heights would learn that the greatest threat was not the enemy you could see, but the one who knew exactly where to strike. Chapter 15. Into the Heart of Darkness. The night air crackled with tension as V-Gan and Wesley moved through the maze of the industrial sector, their footsteps muffled by the hum of machinery and the distant rumble of sirens. The glow of the city lights was swallowed by the blackened skeletons of old factories and smoke-belching pipes, casting eerie shadows that slithered along the ground like living things. "Feels like we're walking straight into the dragon's mouth," Wesley muttered, glancing at V-Gan. Despite his usual quips, there was no mistaking the steel in his eyes. V-Gan said nothing, his focus fixed on the distant glow of Vasquez's lab. He could feel the weight of the city's fate pressing on his shoulders, the echoes of Vasquez's words, betrayal from within, still ringing in his ears. Each step forward was another battle in the war raging within him. Ahead, a figure emerged from the shadows, tall and imposing. Riker had secured the comm towers faster than expected, and now he stood before them, expression grim. "We don't have time for subtlety," he said without preamble, nodding to the dark outline of the lab. "Explosions at the comm tower were a feint. Vasquez is daring us to come to him." "That's why we're here," V-Gan replied, the edge in his voice sharper than steel. He glanced at Wesley. "You're our tech. How do we get in without setting off half the traps Vasquez has planted?" Wesley flashed a tight smile, reaching into his pack and pulling out a small device. "We don't," he said. "We trip them before we're caught in their snare." Riker raised an eyebrow, his eyes narrowing. "You sure about that?" Wesley's smile faded, replaced by the hard, calculating look of a man who'd stared death in the face too many times. "No, but it's our best shot." V-Gan nodded. "Then we move." The trio advanced, skirting the edge of the lab's perimeter where the shadows were deepest. Wesley knelt beside a cluster of wires snaking up a rusted pillar, fingers working quickly as he connected his device. Sparks danced in the dark, illuminating his face in brief electric flashes. "Almost there," he whispered, sweat beading on his brow. Suddenly, a mechanical whir cut through the silence, and the ground beneath them shuddered. V-Gan's instincts kicked in, and he lunged forward, dragging Wesley with him as a section of the ground erupted in a cascade of debris. Riker rolled to the side, drawing his weapon as the dust settled. From the smoky chaos, automated turrets emerged, their barrels glowing with lethal intent. The first shot rang out, missing V-Gan by inches and scorching the concrete where he had just stood. "Move," Riker barked, firing back with precision. The air crackled with the hiss of laser rounds, each blast lighting the dark with deadly brief flashes. Wesley scrambled to his feet, device clutched tightly in his hands. "I need cover to disable them," he shouted. V-Gan planted himself between Wesley and the advancing turrets, eyes narrowing as he focused, muscles coiling with preternatural strength. He surged forward, dodging the onslaught with movements too quick for human eyes to track. His fists connected with the closest turret, metal crumpling under his blow like paper. "Now, Wesley," he roared. Wesley dropped to his knees, fingers moving with lightning speed over the device's panel. A low hum filled the air, followed by a sudden silence as the turrets powered down, their barrels drooping like wilted flowers. Riker exhaled, stepping forward. "We're not done yet. This was only the first line of defense." Before they could regroup, the doors of the lab slid open with a hiss, and a figure stepped into view, backlit by the sickly green glow from within. Vasquez's presence was palpable, eyes gleaming with a mixture of anticipation and satisfaction. "You're predictable, V-Gan," he called, his voice carrying through the night like a taunt. "Righteous, but predictable." V-Gan's jaw clenched, muscles tensing as he took a step forward. "Your games end tonight, Vasquez." Vasquez's smile was thin, devoid of humor. "No, tonight is where it truly begins." He raised a hand, fingers tapping a hidden command on his wrist. The chamber behind him hummed to life, the figure inside shifting, its outline sharp and unnatural. The air changed, thickening with a low, resonant growl that sent a shiver down V-Gan's spine. Wesley's eyes widened, his mouth parting in a silent question. Riker took a step back, gun trained on the chamber. "Meet the future," Vasquez said, voice dripping with triumph. The glass cracked, splintering outward in a spiderweb pattern before shattering completely. The creature within stepped forward, its form human-like but twisted, enhanced with sinewy metal and glowing veins of bioluminescence. "Do you see now?" Vasquez continued, arms spread as if presenting a masterpiece. "This is the price of betrayal, the price of ambition." V-Gan's eyes met the creature's, and a shock of recognition jolted through him. It moved with the grace of someone he knew, its eyes flashing with a familiar light. Lane's light. "No," he whispered, the word strangled in his throat. Vasquez's smile deepened, eyes alight with victory. "Yes, V-Gan, your greatest fear made real. Now, let's see if you're ready to face it." The silence that followed was suffocating, a moment suspended between revelation and chaos. And then, with a snarl that echoed across the night, the creature lunged. Chapter 16, Clash of Titans. The night erupted into chaos as the creature lunged forward, moving with a speed and power that defied its grotesque appearance. V-Gan barely had time to brace himself before the impact sent him skidding across the concrete, the ground tearing beneath him like brittle paper. Pain lanced through his back, sharp and electric, but he pushed it aside, rising to his feet with a snarl. The creature stood poised, muscles coiling and shifting under its metallic, veined skin. Its eyes, so familiar, so wrong, locked onto V-Gan with an intensity that pierced him deeper than any weapon. Lane's eyes, twisted with rage and confusion, gleamed through the creature's visage. "Lane," V-Gan whispered, disbelief anchoring him in place for the briefest of moments. But the monster didn't respond. It only lunged again, fists raised and glowing veins pulsating with a sickly green light. V-Gan met the assault head-on, their fists colliding with a force that sent shockwaves rippling through the air. The sound was a deafening, metallic roar, reverberating off the walls of the lab and out into the open night. Riker shouted orders, his voice slicing through the din. "Wesley, disrupt the power source, whatever is fueling it, now!" Wesley scrambled across the rubble-strewn ground, hands shaking as he rummaged through his pack for anything that could turn the tide. "I'm working on it," he shouted back, sweat streaming down his temples. V-Gan ducked under the creature's next strike, countering with an uppercut that sent sparks flying as his fist connected with the metal and flesh hybrid jaw. The creature staggered, but only for a moment before it retaliated, eyes narrowing in recognition. "You can't save him," Vasquez called from the lab's entrance, his voice cold, almost bored. "He's beyond saving, V-Gan. He's mine now." A fury unlike any V-Gan had ever known roared to life in his chest. He surged forward, grabbing the creature by its shoulders and driving it back. "Lane, if you're in there, fight it." His voice cracked, desperation cracking through the steel of his resolve. The creature hesitated, its eyes flickering with something. An echo, a glimmer of recognition that was gone in an instant. Then, with a guttural roar, it slammed V-Gan against the side of a rusted metal container, the impact making his vision swim with stars. Pain exploded along his side, but he clenched his teeth, fighting the black spots threatening to swallow his sight. Riker and Wesley worked in tandem, firing at Vasquez's guards who had appeared from the shadows, their figures obscured by tactical gear and glinting weapons. The air filled with gunfire and shouted commands, the acrid scent of smoke and burnt metal stinging their nostrils. Come on," Wesley muttered, fingers finally finding the small EMP device in his pack. He looked up, eyes locking onto the chamber that had once contained the creature. Wires and glowing conduits fed into the cracked glass, pulsating like arteries. If he could just reach it. "Riker, cover me," Wesley shouted, dashing towards the chamber as bullets whizzed past him. Riker nodded, stepping into the line of fire without hesitation, drawing attention with precision shots that felled two guards in quick succession. His jaw was set, eyes blazing with the determination of a man who'd risked everything and was ready to give more. V-Gan ducked beneath another strike, the creature's fist cratering the wall behind him. He grappled with it, their faces inches apart, and for the first time he saw a flicker of something human in its eyes. Sorrow, regret. "Lane, please," he gasped, straining against the strength that threatened to crush him. "Fight him." The creature's eyes wavered, the glow dimming for a heartbeat. It was enough. Wesley reached the chamber, slamming the EMP device against the conduit and pressing the activation button. The device whined, building in intensity until a pulse of blue light erupted from it, sweeping through the room like a wave. The machinery around them sputtered, lights flickering as the creature staggered, its body convulsing as the veins pulsing with Vasquez's control began to dim. Vasquez's eyes widened in rage and panic. "No, you don't know what you're doing." He lunged toward the failing controls, hands moving frantically over keys as sparks showered around him. The creature collapsed to its knees, eyes flickering between agony and recognition. V-Gan fell beside it, his breath ragged as he reached out, fingers brushing the metal of its arm. "Lane," he whispered, the word a prayer, a plea. For a moment, the eyes that met his were clear, haunted, and unmistakably Lane's. "I'm sorry," a voice rasped, barely audible, full of pain and clarity that shattered V-Gan's heart. "No," V-Gan said, shaking his head as tears mingled with the sweat and blood on his face. But the recognition was gone as quickly as it came, replaced by a hollow stare as the creature's body slumped, the glow of life dimming to darkness. The room fell silent, the battle paused by the impossible, by the loss that resonated deeper than any sound. Riker lowered his gun, the weight of grief settling over his face. Wesley stood frozen, the victory in his hands meaningless. Vasquez snarled, eyes wild with fury. "You think this changes anything?" He reached for a secondary console, the lab trembling as a low rumble built beneath them. "This city will fall." But before he could press another command, a single shot rang out. Riker stood, gun raised, smoke curling from the barrel. Vasquez's eyes widened in shock, mouth opening as if to curse them all, but no sound came. He crumpled to the floor, the light in his eyes flickering out like the machines around them. Silence returned, broken only by the crackle of sparking wires and the lab's dying hum. V-Gan stared at Lane's motionless form, chest heaving as the weight of victory pressed down on him with the crushing force of loss. "We did it," Wesley said, the words hollow, lost in the grief that swallowed the room whole. V-Gan nodded, eyes never leaving Lane. But at what cost? Chapter 17. The Silence After the Storm. The echoes of the battle seemed to resonate long after the fighting stopped, as though the ghosts of every fallen moment lingered in the air. The lab was in shambles, cables sparking intermittently as the last remnants of Vasquez's twisted experiments fizzled out. The sickly green glow that had once dominated the room had been replaced by a fractured, uncertain light that barely illuminated the devastation. V-Gan knelt beside Lane's lifeless form, the weight of grief pressing down on him until it felt as if the very ground might give way. The familiar features twisted with metal and bio-enhancements were finally still, their torment ended. But the peace that should have come with that stillness was nowhere to be found. Lane's eyes, once vibrant with hope and conviction, stared unseeing at the ceiling. Riker stood nearby, weapon lowered but still in hand, eyes scanning the room as if expecting Vasquez to rise again, fueled by the sheer spite he had carried to his death. But the scientist's body lay crumpled by the console, the lifeblood of his mad ambition spilling onto the cold floor. There was no victory here, only the stark reality of what had been lost. Wesley stepped forward, the noise of his boots scraping against broken glass and metal breaking the silence. His usual grin was absent, replaced by an expression of quiet devastation. "V-Gan," he said, voice tentative as if he were afraid to break the moment. V-Gan didn't look up. His fingers brushed Lane's face, gently closing the eyes that had haunted him for years. A muscle in his jaw tightened as he rose, the grief in his eyes hardening into something resolute. "We did what we had to do," he said, the words flat, almost rehearsed. But there was no masking the way his shoulders sagged under the weight of them. Riker moved closer, holstering his gun as he searched V-Gan's face. "It's over," he said, though it sounded more like a question than a statement. V-Gan met Riker's eyes, the storm in his own gaze slowly receding to reveal exhaustion. "It's over for Vasquez," he agreed, his voice rough. "But this city won't heal just because he's gone." Sarah Elara entered the lab, eyes wide with the shock of what she was seeing. She had remained at the barracks to coordinate, but the moment the last message came in, she knew she needed to be here. Her gaze fell to Lane's body, the breath catching in her throat as tears welled up unbidden. The notebook in her hands trembled, and she clutched it tighter as if it were the only thing tethering her to the ground. "We lost him," she whispered, eyes meeting V-Gan's. The unspoken question hung between them. "What now?" Wesley shifted uncomfortably, looking at the others before breaking the silence. "What now?" he echoed, voice cracking. "What happens next?" The room seemed to close in, the remnants of Vasquez's madness still buzzing like an electric hum in their bones. V-Gan looked around, taking in the faces of the people who had followed him through this chaos. Their expressions mirrored his own, relief tinged with the guilt of survival. "We rebuild," V-Gan said finally, the words steadying him even as they tasted hollow. "Not just for us, but for everyone who fought and fell. For Lane." Riker nodded, a silent agreement passing between them, but there was a wariness in his eyes, as if he were already scanning the horizon for the next storm. "And if there are others out there taking Vasquez's place?" "Then we'll be ready," Syrah said, stepping forward, voice gaining strength. She laid Lane's notebook on the console, its pages open to the last notes he'd ever written. "This isn't just an end, it's a beginning. We have to be the ones to shape it." The room fell silent again, but this time the quiet was different. It was the stillness that follows a storm, heavy with rain-soaked hope and the whispers of change. V-Gan turned to Sarah, a flicker of trust and gratitude in his eyes. "We'll do it together," he said, not just to her but to all of them. As the first light of dawn began to seep through the broken windows, casting a pale, forgiving glow over the ruins of Vasquez's lab, V-Gan stepped forward, leaving behind the ghosts that had haunted him for too long. The fight was far from over, but for the first time in years, he felt a spark of hope that maybe, just maybe, they could rebuild something stronger from the ashes. Chapter 18. The City Stirs. The city awoke slowly, as if sensing the tension that lingered in the air. News of Vasquez's defeat spread, whispered from mouth to ear with the urgency of survival. For some, the dawn was a promise. For others, it was a reminder that power vacuums never lasted long. The team returned to the barracks under the watchful eyes of those who had trusted them with their safety. Syrah lingered at the back, watching as V-Gan moved among the people, a man who had been their beacon and their shadow. Wesley sat at a table, head in his hands, while Riker spoke with the remaining operatives, issuing commands with a voice that held no trace of hesitation. Syrah stepped forward, placing Lane's notebook on the central table where everyone could see it. She looked up, catching V-Gan's eye. "This city isn't safe yet," she said. "There will be more like Vasquez, more who want to tear down what we're trying to rebuild." V-Gan nodded, understanding the weight of her words. "We'll be ready," he said, echoing his earlier promise. But deep in the city, in corners where the light of dawn couldn't reach, others were already moving. Shadows whispered to one another, plans unfurling like dark wings. And as Verde Heights stirred, the promise of peace was met with the certainty of another storm brewing on the horizon. V-Gan felt it in his bones, a tremor that warned of challenges yet to come. But this time, he knew he wasn't alone. And for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, he believed that together they might stand a chance. Would you like to continue with the scene setting up the next wave of threats, or delve into how the team begins to mend their personal rifts and prepare for their next challenge? Chapter 19. Healing the Fractures. The barracks held the quiet of exhaustion, the kind that settles deep into bone after a battle that changes everything. The air was thick with unspoken words as the team took stock of their surroundings and, more importantly, each other. The adrenaline that had kept them moving through Vasquez's labyrinth was gone, leaving behind only the raw, exposed truth of who they had become in the process. V-Gan stood by the window, the soft morning light spilling across his face. It illuminated the shadows under his eyes, the marks of sleepless nights and the grief that had become a permanent part of him. Yet in this moment, there was also a sense of relief, small, fragile, but there. Sarah sat at the long metal table, her fingers tracing the edges of Lane's notebook. She had spent the night reading through the pages, finding comfort and pain in the familiar loops of his handwriting. It reminded her of the hope they once shared and the weight of the trust he'd placed in her. She lifted her gaze and met V-Gans' eyes, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. The wounds between them were deep, but they were beginning to close. Riker entered the room, his uniform disheveled, a day's worth of stubble rough on his jaw. He dropped a folder onto the table, the sound breaking the silence like a sharp breath. "These are our next targets," he said, the voice of a man who had never known how to stop fighting. "Rumors are spreading about groups that want to fill the gap Vasquez left. We need to move before they get organized." Wesley looked up from where he sat, slumped in a chair, eyes bloodshot but alert. "And here I thought we'd get at least a day off," he muttered, though the edge in his tone lacked its usual humor. He met Sarah's eyes, the ghost of a smile flickering across his lips. "Guess peace isn't on the agenda, huh?" Sarah shook her head, her own smile bittersweet. "No, but maybe we can work toward it." V-Gan turned from the window, taking in the faces of his team. These were the people who had stood beside him, doubted him, believed in him. They were fractured but not broken. He knew that whatever came next, they would face it together, and together they would be stronger. "We don't just react this time," he said, his voice low but gaining strength as he spoke. "We plan. We build alliances, we find out who else is out there, and we make sure that no one can do what Vasquez did." Riker's eyes narrowed thoughtfully, and he nodded. "We root out the threats before they become one." Wesley sat up, his fingers tapping a silent rhythm on the table. "I've got contacts who might know a thing or two about these rising factions. It's time to call in some favors." Sarah stood, the chair scraping the floor as she pushed it back. "And I'll dig into what Lane left behind. There might be more in his notes, something we missed. He always saw connections others didn't." V-Gan's chest swelled with a feeling he hadn't allowed himself to acknowledge in years. Hope. It was fragile, balanced on the edge of grief, but it was there, shining quietly through the cracks of loss. "I need each of you to be ready," he said, looking at them each in turn. "The next fight won't come from a single enemy. It'll come from every corner that's watched us struggle and thinks we're weak. But they don't know us. They don't know that when we're pushed to the edge, we don't fall. We rise." A moment of silence followed his words, heavy with understanding. And then Riker stepped forward, extending a hand. "We're with you," he said simply. Wesley pushed up from his chair, clapping his hands together and rubbing them with mock enthusiasm. "All right, let's go remind the city who's really in charge." Sarah smiled, a warmth spreading through her chest that dulled the ache of grief. She glanced at Lane's notebook one last time, the pages full of his convictions, his belief in what they could be. "We owe it to him," she whispered, too softly for anyone but herself to hear. V-Gan looked around the room, a sense of unity settling over them. The battles ahead would be fierce, but this was different. They were different. No longer just a group of people fighting their own battles, but a team bonded by shared scars and a promise to stand against whatever darkness came next. "Let's get to work," he said, the faintest smile lifting the corners of his mouth. And as they moved, the light of the new day reached further into the corners of the barracks, casting away shadows and illuminating a path forward, paved not just with the ashes of their past, but with the steel of their resolve. Chapter 20. Preparing for the next wave. Preparations began in earnest. Riker divided the team into units, each with a specific mission. Scouts would map out areas suspected of housing insurgent groups, while tech operatives like Wesley would secure their communications and scan for encoded messages that could give away enemy movements. Sarah coordinated strategy meetings, her mind sharp and unyielding as she pieced together the puzzle that Lane's notes hinted at. A network that went deeper than any of them had realized. In quiet moments, V-Gan found himself slipping into memories. Lane's voice would come unbidden, offering counsel or a joke that eased the weight on his heart, if only for a breath. But instead of being a reminder of loss, it now served as a push to keep going. to fight for the vision Lane had always held so close. One night, as the city settled into the uneasy quiet of dusk, Sarah found V-Gan alone on the rooftop of the barracks. The city stretched out before them, alive with lights that masked the wounds it carried. She stepped beside him, not speaking at first, the silence between them filled with the understanding of those who had shared a battlefield and grief. "Lane would be proud of you," she said finally, the words soft and sincere. V-Gan turned, the shadow of a smile flickering in his eyes. "He'd be proud of all of us." They stood there, watching the city together as it pulsed with life, the promise of peace a whisper carried on the wind. The fight was far from over, but with allies at his side and the weight of grief transformed into purpose, V-Gan knew they would be ready. Chapter 21. New Alliances, Old Wounds. The barracks were alive with a buzz that had been absent since before Vasquez's reign of chaos. Agents moved with purpose, the echo of their voices blending with the steady hum of computers and communication devices. Maps and charts were strewn across tables, dotted with red and blue markers indicating potential allies and known threats. It was a controlled storm of strategy and preparation, one that spoke of resilience and determination. Sarah Elara sat in the strategy room, hunched over Lane's notebook, eyes scanning the looping handwriting for anything they might have missed. The whispers in the margins and hurried notes, sketched during late-night conversations with Lane, spoke of more than just immediate threats. They hinted at a web of powerful shadowy players who moved through the city unseen, manipulating factions for their own ends. Wesley Marks entered, a sly grin breaking through the exhaustion on his face. He set a steaming cup of coffee beside Sarah and plopped into the chair opposite her. "You look like you've been running on fumes," he said, raising an eyebrow. She managed a smile, the corners of her eyes crinkling. "Sleep is a luxury we can't afford right now." Wesley chuckled, but it lacked real humor. He glanced at the map pinned to the wall, crisscrossed with colored strings, connecting locations, people, and moments in time. "The city feels like a powder keg waiting for a spark." "It is," Sarah admitted, fingers tracing a line in Lane's notes that read, "The key lies not in strength, but in unity." She looked up at Wesley, her expression serious. "We need more than just us. We need alliances that go beyond familiar faces." "Funny you should mention that," Wesley said, leaning forward, the grin returning. "I called in a favor from an old contact, a former military strategist who's gone a bit rogue since his discharge. If there's anyone who knows how to piece together a defense and an offense simultaneously, it's him." Before Sarah could respond, the strategy room door creaked open and Captain Riker Stone entered, flanked by V-Gan. Both men carried the weight of the city's expectations, but there was a steadiness in their strides that suggested readiness. Behind them was a tall, lean figure with sharp eyes and a disheveled uniform that spoke of long days and even longer nights. His presence exuded a mix of casual arrogance and hard-won respect. The man nodded to Wesley, a grin flashing across his rugged features. "Looks like you're in deeper trouble than usual, Marks." "Nice to see you too, Miles," Wesley said, his tone laced with friendly sarcasm. "Everyone, this is Miles Cade. He's been in more wars than any of us care to count, and he owes me a debt or two." Miles stepped forward, nodding to Riker and V-Gan. His gaze swept over the room, assessing each face, pausing momentarily on Sarah with a flicker of recognition. "I hear you've got a mess on your hands. Good. I like messes." Riker smirked, arms crossing over his chest. "We're not just cleaning up, we're preparing for the next attack. Vasquez may be gone, but there's more lurking in the dark. Factions that want what he wanted, and others who will see this as an opportunity to strike." Miles's expression shifted to one of focused intent. "Then let's not waste any more time. First, you need to understand that the alliances we'll need aren't going to be straightforward. We're talking about groups who barely trust themselves, let alone anyone trying to lead them." V-Gan stepped forward, the tension in his frame mirrored by the intensity in his voice. "Then we show them that unity is the only way they survive. We offer them safety, strength, and a seat at the table." Miles nodded slowly. "And what if they refuse?" "Then we show them why they can't afford to," V-Gan said, his eyes locked with Miles's, the room charged with the unspoken acknowledgement that peace, while preferable, was not the only option. mending fractures. Later, as the team dispersed to plan their next moves, Sierra lingered behind. The weight of Lane's note sat heavy in her lap, and she traced his handwriting with her fingers, lost in thought. "You're thinking too loudly," came V-Gan's voice from the doorway. He walked in, his presence filling the room in that quiet, commanding way that reminded her of Lane. Sarah looked up, the tired smile she'd been holding slipping into something more genuine. "I can't help it. Lane knew more than we realized. These notes aren't just scraps. They're warnings, maybe even a guide." V-Gan sat across from her, eyes softening as he regarded the notebook. "He saw things we missed," he said, voice tinged with regret and admiration, "but we see them now because of him." Sarah nodded, a silent tear sliding down her cheek before she could stop it. She wiped it away, eyes meeting V-Gan's, finding in them the shared understanding of loss and purpose. "We have to be better," she whispered. "We will be," V-Gan promised, the conviction in his voice as strong as the city's foundations. "For Lane, for the city, for everyone who believes in what we're trying to do." The silence that followed wasn't heavy, but filled with the quiet of two people who knew the battle was far from over but were ready to fight it, together. Gathering allies. The next few days were a blur of meetings and negotiations. Miles Cade proved invaluable, reaching out to fringe groups and military contacts who had long abandoned the idea of working within the system. Some came willingly, old loyalties rekindled by promises of unity and survival. Others had to be persuaded with the hard truth that neutrality would no longer be an option. Riker led a contingent into the docks, where rumors of a powerful criminal syndicate known as the Iron Snakes suggested potential allies, or adversaries. Their leader, an enigmatic figure known only as Dara, was as shrewd as she was ruthless. If convinced, her network could secure the city's vulnerable points faster than any official force. Meanwhile, Sierra met with community leaders and old allies Lane had once trusted. They were the lifeblood of the city, the ones who could rally the people, make them believe that peace was worth fighting for, even in the face of impending threats. A shared purpose. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the barracks came alive with the sound of people working together, V-Gan stood on the rooftop, watching the city transform from day to night. The lights of Verde Heights shimmered, hiding the scars and promising something better. Footsteps behind him made him turn. Sarah stood there, her gaze on the skyline. "They're starting to believe," she said softly, a small smile playing at her lips. V-Gan nodded, the weight on his chest lifting slightly. "We'll give them a reason to." The city was far from healed, but in that moment it felt possible that it could be. Together, they would make it so. Chapter 22. The Echo of Shadows. The night air was sharp with the bite of anticipation as Verde Heights settled into an uneasy silence. The city, while seemingly at peace, was a smouldering ember, and all it would take was a single spark to reignite the chaos. The team at the barracks worked tirelessly, eyes dark-circled and minds frayed with exhaustion, but hope pushed them onward. Their newly formed alliances were tentative, bound by necessity more than trust, and that fragility made them vulnerable. Miles Cade stood in the control room, eyes fixed on a grid of monitors displaying various sections of the city. Dotted across the screens were live feeds from Allied outposts, each one showing sentinels patrolling or neighborhoods bustling under the watchful gaze of makeshift security details. Sierra entered, a file clutched in her hands, her expression tight with concern. "We have a problem," she said without preamble, placing the file on the table in front of Miles. "There's been chatter on the encrypted channels we've been monitoring. A group calling themselves the Black Dusk is planning something, and soon." Miles's eyes narrowed as he scanned the notes and printouts she laid out. The name Black Dusk was familiar to him, an old spectre that haunted the underbelly of power brokers and rogue operatives. A network, faceless and ruthless, that thrived on destabilization. "They're real?" he asked, more to himself than to Sierra. "They are now," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. V-Gan appeared in the doorway, the tension in the room drawing him in. "What's happening?" he asked, eyes flicking between Sierra and Miles. "Black Dusk," Miles said, his voice like the rasp of steel. "They're not just a ghost story. They're here, and they're planning to make a statement." The weight of the name settled over V-Gan, and for a moment the room seemed colder. He glanced at Sarah, whose eyes were filled with a mix of fear and determination. "Do we know where or when?" Sarah shook her head. "Not yet. But there's more. We've intercepted messages that suggest someone high up, someone we haven't identified yet, has been funding them. If we don't act fast, this could tear apart everything we've built." Riker entered the room, catching the tail end of the conversation. "We need intel," he said, crossing his arms, "and we need it now. We can't move on shadows and whispers." Miles straightened, his mind already piecing together a plan. "We send scouts to the known hotspots, places where Vasquez's influence was strongest and where the new power plays are happening. If the Black Dusk is preparing a strike, they'll have operatives moving there." V-Gan nodded, jaw tightening. "And we rally our allies. If this is the test that will shatter them, they need to know what's coming." The fractured response. As night deepened, the team split into units. Riker led a contingent to the industrial quarter, where rumors of new gatherings had surfaced. Wesley took a smaller group to sweep the market district, their goal to find informants willing to talk for a price. Sarah remained at the barracks, coordinating the scouts and passing through the overwhelming flood of digital chatter. Miles stayed with her, eyes darting between the scrolling data and live feeds. He noticed the small tremor in her hands as she worked, the way her jaw clenched with each ping of an incoming message. "They'll come through," he said, more confident than he felt. Sarah met his eyes briefly, a flicker of gratitude passing across her face. "They have to." The comms crackled with static before Riker's voice came through, strained and urgent. "We've got eyes on movement near the south docks. It's bigger than we thought. Reinforcements needed now." V-Gan grabbed his earpiece, voice cutting through the silence. "Hold your position, Riker. We're on our way." The strike at the docks. The docks were a sprawl of rusting metal and creaking wood, slick with sea mist and shadowed by towering cranes. The moon cast an eerie glow across the water, broken only by the rhythmic flash of a distant lighthouse. Riker's team lay low behind a stack of crates, eyes locked on the figures moving in the distance. The Black Dusk operatives were masked and clad in dark armor that seemed to drink in the light. They moved with practiced ease, setting up equipment that hummed with a mechanical menace. Riker's gut tightened. Whatever they were preparing, it was big. Suddenly, a voice shouted in the distance. One of the scouts had been spotted. The silence shattered as a burst of gunfire lit the scene, throwing it into chaos. Riker leapt up, issuing commands into his comms. "Engage! Engage now!" V-Gan and his team surged from their hidden positions, meeting the operatives head-on. The clash of metal and shouts filled the air as Wesley's group flanked from the right, their sudden appearance catching the Black Dusk off guard. One of the operatives, taller than the rest and moving with unsettling speed, targeted V-Gan, a blade gleaming in the moonlight. They met in a clash of strength, V-Gan's fist colliding with armor that sparked on impact. The operative staggered but countered, eyes glinting with a cold, predatory focus. Riker shouted to V-Gan, "They're planting charges. We need to stop them now." V-Gan's eyes darted to the far end of the dock, where a cluster of operatives were working frantically. "Wesley, disrupt those devices," he shouted. Wesley nodded, slipping past the skirmish with practiced agility, his fingers already moving to hack into the devices. The screen of his handheld console glowed as he worked, sweat trickling down his temple. Come on," he muttered. An explosion rocked the dock, sending splinters and metal shrapnel flying. The operatives began to retreat, their mission partially complete. V-Gan gritted his teeth, muscles burning as he launched a final punch that sent the masked leader sprawling into a pile of broken crates. The operative didn't rise. "They're falling back," Riker shouted, eyes narrowing as the remaining operatives disappeared into the dark. "We need to move. They'll have a second wave." Wesley stood, breathing hard, his console blinking with an alert. His face paled as he read the data. "This was just a distraction," he said, voice hollow. "The real target is the main power grid. They're going to cut the city's power." The team exchanged looks, the gravity of what Wesley said settling over them like a shroud. "Then we have no time to lose," V-Gan said, voice resolute. "We stop them before they turn this city dark." Chapter 23. The Race for Power. The team moved with urgency, their movements a well-practiced dance of precision and silent communication. The distant glow of the power grid loomed ahead, a fortress of steel and high-voltage lines that kept Verde Heights humming with life. Losing it would mean not just darkness, but chaos, an open door for the city's lurking threats. V-Gan led the charge, his body a blur of coiled strength as they navigated the maze of alleys and narrow streets that led to the power station. Wesley kept pace, the glow from his handheld device casting anxious shadows on his face as he relayed updates. "They're already inside," he said, voice strained. "I'm picking up multiple signals. This isn't just a hit, it's a full-scale incursion." Riker's eyes narrowed as he scanned the surrounding rooftops. The darkness felt alive, pressing in with the weight of unseen eyes. "We need to split up. We cover more ground that way," he said. He gestured to Wesley. "Find the control room and secure the override systems. If we can't stop them, we need to stall them." Wesley nodded, slipping away with a small team. The air buzzed with tension, each step a reminder that the power grid wasn't just another battle. It was the heart of the city, vulnerable and exposed. Sarah caught V-Gan's eye, stepping in closer. "Be careful," she said, the weight of their shared history hanging between them. Her fingers brushed his arm, a fleeting connection that anchored them both. V-Gan's expression softened for the briefest moment. "You too." With that, they pushed forward, splitting into smaller units. The power grid loomed ahead, a steel labyrinth bathed in the cold light of fluorescent tubes. The hum of transformers was almost deafening, masking the sound of their approach. The fight in the shadows. Inside the power station, the Black Dusk operatives moved with chilling efficiency. Dark figures darted between consoles, setting charges and connecting wires that thrummed with a sinister glow. The leader of the incursion stood at the center, tall and armored, a mask that glinted black covering their face. V-Gan burst through the entrance, the sight of the saboteurs igniting a fire in his veins. He lunged forward, catching the nearest operative by surprise, and slammed them into a console, sparks erupting as circuits failed. The rest of the team poured in behind him, weapons ready and eyes scanning for any sign of an ambush. "Stop them!" the masked leader shouted, voice muffled but strong. The command sent a wave of operatives into motion, weapons raised as they charged. The room exploded into chaos. Riker's gun barked out commands of its own, each shot precise, felling operatives with the efficiency of years spent in battle. Wesley's voice crackled over the comms. "I'm in the control room. There's a failsafe here, but it's rigged to blow if they finish setting those charges." Sarah fought her way to the nearest console, ducking behind it as an explosion rocked the room, sending a hail of metal fragments clattering across the floor. She connected her portable interface, fingers flying over the keys. "I'm trying to disrupt their signal," she said, voice tight with concentration. V-Gan faced off with the masked leader, their eyes meeting for the first time in the electric glow of sparking wires. There was something familiar in the way the figure moved, a precision that reminded him of Vasquez's creations, but with an added ferocity. They traded blows, each impact sending shockwaves through their bones. The leader was fast, unnaturally so, their strikes sharp and calculated. "Who are you?" V-Gan demanded, blocking a blow that would have cracked his ribs. The leader tilted their head, a mocking tilt that sent a chill down his spine. "A shadow of what you couldn't protect," they said, voice low and seething. The words were like a key turning in a lock, and V-Gan's eyes widened. The pieces clicked together too late. The leader twisted away, pressing a command on their wrist. An alert blared through the station, and the charges began to count down, their glow pulsing with ominous speed. "Everyone, get out!" V-Gan shouted, the urgency in his voice sending a shock of adrenaline through the team. Sarah's eyes snapped up, meeting his. "Not yet," she typed furiously, the countdown reflected in her wide eyes. "I can disable them, just a few more seconds." Wesley's voice cut through the comms. "Sarah, don't be a hero. Get out of there." V-Gan's heart pounded as he pushed past the operatives, still fighting to keep them contained. He reached Sarah just as she hit the final keystroke, the countdown freezing at 3 seconds. The glow of the charges dulled, their threat neutralized. The room fell silent, but for their gasping breaths and the hiss of damaged wires. The masked leader watched from a shadowed corner, eyes glinting before they slipped away into the dark, the sound of their retreat lost in the chaos. Riker surveyed the room, holstering his weapon as the last operative fell. His eyes met V-Gans, relief and exhaustion mingling on his face. "We got lucky," he said, voice rough. Sarah stood, knees shaking as the adrenaline left her. She managed a weak smile, looking at V-Gan. "No, we didn't. We were ready." But V-Gan's eyes were on the shadow where the leader had disappeared, the haunting words echoing in his mind, a shadow of what you couldn't protect. He swallowed hard, the relief of victory tempered by the knowledge that this was just the beginning. The fallout and reflection. Back at the barracks, the team regrouped, bruised and weary, but alive. The power grid had been saved, but the warning had been clear. The Black Dusk was real, and they were watching, waiting for the next chance to strike. V-Gan stood in the quiet of the barracks' main hall, eyes distant as he replayed the fight in his mind. Sarah approached, her footsteps soft against the concrete. She touched his arm, the warmth grounding him. "We stopped them tonight," she said. "That has to count for something." "It does," V-Gan said, voice low, "but this isn't over, not by a long shot." Riker entered, eyes meeting theirs with a hard edge. "We'll be ready," he said, more a statement than a promise. Outside, the city lay in the quiet embrace of early dawn, unaware of the battle that had just saved it. But the silence was deceptive. In the dark corners where power festered, the Black Dusk regrouped, and their leader watched with calculating eyes, ready to test the city's fragile alliances once again. Would you like to continue with a deeper exploration of the Black Dusk and the leader's motives, or delve into how the team strengthens their alliances to prepare for the inevitable next battle? Chapter 24. Shadows in the Dark. The hidden lair of the Black Dusk was nestled deep beneath the foundations of the old shipyards, an abandoned warren where the scent of rust and salt mixed with the hum of unseen machines. The walls were lined with screens flickering with data, each one revealing snippets of the city above, places marked as targets, people marked as threats, and movements monitored down to the second. Here the shadows felt alive, pulsing with the quiet hum of malevolent purpose. The masked leader stood at the center, hands resting on the edge of a metal table strewn with blueprints and surveillance photos. The room was lit by a sickly yellow light that cast long, jagged shadows across their armor. Behind the mask, eyes glinted with controlled fury and the remnants of a deeper pain that had shaped them into what they now were. A weapon forged from loss. A voice spoke from the shadows, smooth and cultured, with a hint of sarcasm. "You nearly had them tonight," said Ansel Thorne, a former intelligence operative turned rogue strategist, and the closest thing the Black Dusk had to a second in command. His pale eyes caught the light as he stepped forward, his slender frame wrapped in a dark, tailored suit that looked out of place in the grim surroundings. "Almost isn't good enough," the leader replied, voice edged with frustration. They slammed a fist on the table, making the papers shudder. "V-Gans' team should have fallen. I want them to feel the weight of their failures." Ansel's lips twisted into a wry smile. "Patience, my dear. The real art of dismantling a hero isn't to crush them all at once. It's to break them piece by piece. Tonight we planted a seed of doubt. They know we're here. They know what we're capable of. Let that fear fester." The leader's eyes narrowed, their fingers brushing a photo of Lane Patrick, eyes bright and full of life. The image was a reminder of everything they had lost, everything that had driven them into the depths of vengeance. Lane's death was more than a catalyst. It was an indictment of a world that allowed heroes to falter, a world where trust was a weapon that cut both ways. "V-Gan needs to understand," the leader said, voice dropping to a whisper that was almost lost in the hum of the machinery. "He needs to see that hope is fragile, that it shatters when the right pressure is applied." Ansel's smile faded, replaced by a seriousness that softened his sharp features. "And when he's finally on his knees, what then? Will you show him who you are? Will you let him know that the shadow haunting him was born from his own failure?" The leader straightened, their posture rigid with determination. The mask felt suffocating, a necessary shield that protected not just identity, but the vulnerability that still simmered beneath the surface. He'll know when the time comes, and when he does, he'll understand what true betrayal looks like. The room fell silent, the declaration hanging heavy in the charged air. The operatives milling about the edges of the room moved with the discipline of soldiers who understood their mission, but not the motivations behind it. Only Ansel and the leader knew the truth, that the battle was as personal as it was strategic. Ansel leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "We've intercepted chatter from their barracks. They're scrambling to tighten their alliances, to bolster defenses. We need to strike before they can consolidate their power." The leader nodded, the motion deliberate. "We will, but not with brute force. We'll tear at the seams of their unity. We'll give them a taste of what it means to doubt the ones they trust." Ansel's eyes glinted with intrigue. And who will be the first to break? The leader's gaze shifted to the far side of the room, where a series of monitors displayed live feeds of V-Gan, Sira, and Riker, their faces etched with determination and fatigue. A slow, cold smile curved beneath the mask. "The ones who carry the most guilt. We start with V-Gan." The origin of shadows. The leader paced the room long after Ansel had left, memories clawing their way to the surface. They pulled off the mask, revealing a face lined with the shadows of pain and loss. It was a face that had once been familiar, before betrayal and grief twisted it into something unrecognizable. In a past life, they were known as Lucas Rane, a name that once carried weight as an ally to Lane Patrick and a silent observer of V-Gan's rise. Lucas had watched from the periphery as Lane devoted himself to a cause that demanded sacrifices no one should bear alone. And when the city turned against its protectors, when Lane fell and V-Gan's strength proved inadequate, Lucas's belief in heroes shattered. Vasquez had been the first to offer an outlet, a chance to transform that disillusionment into power. But where Vasquez sought control, Lucas sought something deeper, a reckoning that would force V-Gan to confront the consequences of his failures. When Vasquez's plans crumbled and chaos threatened to consume Verde Heights, Lucas saw an opportunity. The Black Dusk was born from that void, drawing in operatives who believed in the power of fear and the weakness of hope. Lucas traced the scars on his face, remnants of the night Lane died, when he had tried to save him and failed. Every breath since then had been an echo of that failure, a reminder that sometimes the greatest enemies were the ones created in the aftermath of loss. "This is only the beginning," Lucas whispered, eyes hardening as he stared at the screen showing V-Gan. The hero had no idea that the face behind the shadowed threat was one he had once trusted, that the Black Dusk was more than a name. It was a reckoning, an embodiment of every shadow cast by his brightest moments. The ripples of dread. Morning in Verde Heights came with an unease that hung in the air like smog. Word of the attack on the power grid spread quickly, whispered among citizens and officials alike. The city knew it had been close, that their fragile peace was more precarious than ever. And in the barracks, the tension simmered as the team debriefed, exhaustion and frustration written across every face. V-Gan stood at the head of the table, hands braced against its surface, eyes scanning the maps and reports scattered before him. "We need to know who they are, where they came from. This Black Dusk isn't just another gang or rogue faction. They're organized, and they know us." Riker nodded, the dark circles under his eyes deepening. "They were one step ahead of us last night. We need to change that." Syrah's voice was steady, but her hands fidgeted with a pen. "I've run searches on their symbols, their tech. It's not local. These people have outside support, maybe even military-grade funding. We need to look beyond the city for answers." Wesley leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "So we dig. We find the thread and pull until we unravel whoever's pulling their strings." V-Gan met each of their eyes, finding strength in their resolve, but somewhere in the quietest corners of his mind, doubt whispered. The leader of the Black Dusk had spoken as if they knew him, as if they understood what haunted him most. It was a taunt he couldn't shake, and it made him wonder who among them might have been overlooked, who might still harbor secrets waiting to surface. And somewhere, Lucas Rane watched their confusion with satisfaction, knowing that the first seeds of doubt had been sown. The real test was coming, And this time, V-Gan would face more than just a battle. He would face the ghosts of everything he had failed to protect. Chapter 25. Threads of the Past. The barracks buzzed with the low hum of strategizing voices, each conversation punctuated by the soft rustle of maps, blueprints, and the tapping of keyboards. The team was running on the adrenaline of survival, but under the surface, doubt and tension simmered. They knew they needed answers, and they needed them fast. V-Gan sat at a table, his eyes darting over a series of documents that Sira had compiled. Each file was marked with the insignia of the Black Dusk, its sharp, minimalist design a silent challenge to everything they stood for. The attack on the power grid had been a statement, one that left Verde Heights reeling and the team scrambling for any clue that would lead them to the masked leader who seemed to know V-Gan's deepest fears. Riker entered, his presence drawing eyes as he dropped a thick folder onto the table. "Old military records," he said, his voice gruff. "If the Black Dusk is as organized as we think, they have someone leading them who knows how to mobilize with precision. I've highlighted a few names that stood out." Syrah leaned over the folder, scanning the contents. The list was full of men and women who had been trained to fight wars, strategize in hostile environments, and use psychological warfare as a second language. But none of them fit the pattern they'd seen with the Black Dusk, except one. "Lucas Rani," she said, voice dropping to a whisper as she looked up at V-Gan. He was a field operative, intelligence and special tactics, discharged years ago under mysterious circumstances. The name hit V-Gan like a physical blow, his vision narrowing as memories unfurled, unbidden. Lucas had been there, a constant shadow on the periphery of their missions, always watching, always calculating. Lane had vouched for him, said he was trustworthy, loyal to a fault, but something had changed after Lane's death. Lucas had disappeared, his absence like a scar they never spoke of. "He was one of ours," V-Gan said, voice tight. The room fell silent, each team member exchanging glances that ranged from surprise to dawning realization. "He worked with Lane and me on several missions. He was a friend. Or at least I thought he was." Riker's expression darkened. "If he's behind the Black Dusk, then he knows us, our strengths, our weaknesses. That's how they're staying ahead." Sarah's eyes softened, flicking to V-Gan as she asked the question no one else dared to. "What happened to him after Lane's death? Do you know why he left?" V-Gan shook his head, frustration tightening his jaw. "No. We searched, but it was like he vanished. We thought he might have been taken out. One more casualty in the chaos that followed. But if he's alive, if he's leading this—" Wesley, who had been silent until now, cleared his throat. "Then this isn't just about power or territory, this is personal." The first clues. Determined to trace Lucas's path after his disappearance, Sira delved into digital archives and private records Lane had left behind. Pages of encrypted logs, hastily typed emails, and meeting notes began to form a story. One of disillusionment, betrayal, and silence. "There's correspondence here between Lane and Lucas," Sira said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her fingers. "It looks like Lane was worried about Vasquez's growing influence. But he also mentioned Lucas had been distant, asking questions that Lane couldn't answer." V-Gan leaned over her shoulder, eyes narrowing as he read Lane's words. "Lucas is different now. He talks about the city like it's a battlefield and every hero as a liability. I don't know how to reach him, but I fear if we don't, he'll do something we can't undo." Lane knew, V-Gan whispered, the realization sinking in like a stone. He knew Lucas was slipping away. Riker's voice cut through the somber moment. "And now we know why the Black Dusk has been so precise. Lucas had years to plan this, to build alliances we haven't even considered. He's not just reacting, he's orchestrating." Syrah's eyes met V-Gan's, a shared understanding passing between them. Lucas's vendetta wasn't just against V-Gan or the team, it was against the idea of heroism itself, forged from the belief that the system they fought for had failed them, that Lane's death was the proof of it. "Then we make the next move," V-Gan said, determination hardening his features. "We find Lucas and we confront him, but we do it on our terms, not his." A lead emerges. Wesley cracked his knuckles, eyes gleaming as he leaned over his laptop. I've been sifting through comms chatter and encrypted lines the Black Dusk has used. There's a pattern, subtle, but there. They're relaying through an old network hub on the east side. It was decommissioned after Vasquez's first takeover. No one's touched it in years. Except Lucas, Riker said, understanding dawning. He'd know the value of using forgotten tech. It's off the grid, untraceable. V-Gan nodded, a plan forming. We go there, but not in force. If Lucas suspects we're closing in, he'll vanish again, and next time he won't leave breadcrumbs. Syrah stood, eyes fierce with resolve. I'm going with you. If there are traps or hidden data, I'm the best chance we have of disarming them. Riker opened his mouth to argue, but caught the steel in her gaze and nodded instead. We all know what's at stake. We do this smart, and we do this fast. A shadowed reckoning. The team moved under cover of night, the air heavy with anticipation. The east side was quiet, a forgotten part of Verde Heights where buildings leaned like tired sentinels, and the only light came from the dim glow of street lamps. They reached the old network hub, its doors rusted and the windows shattered, standing like a relic of a past war. Inside, the hum of old servers greeted them, a ghostly chorus that made the hairs on the back of V-Gan's neck stand on end. The shadows seemed deeper here, filled with the weight of what they might find. Syrah's fingers danced over the keys of her portable console, eyes narrowing as lines of code scrolled across the screen. He's been here, she said, voice tight. Recently. A soft click echoed from the darkness, followed by a voice that froze them in place. You were always clever, Syrah. Lane spoke highly of you. V-Gan's breath caught as a figure stepped into the dim light, face hidden behind a familiar mask that gleamed black. Lucas Rane, the former ally turned phantom threat, eyes hard and unforgiving. Lucas, V-Gan said, voice low and steady, it doesn't have to be this way. Lucas tilted his head, the gesture mocking. You're right, V-Gan, it doesn't. But heroes like you only understand sacrifice when it's forced on them. Tonight you'll learn that lesson. Before V-Gan could respond, Lucas pressed a button on his wrist and the hum of the servers shifted to a high-pitched whine. Lights flickered as a countdown began to pulse in the corner of Syrah's screen. Get out, she shouted, fingers scrambling over the keyboard. It's rigged to blow. The room exploded into movement, the team scattering as Lucas vanished into the shadows, leaving only the echo of his words and the promise of a reckoning yet to come. Chapter 26. The Weight of Shadows. The network hub was a smouldering shell, the scent of burnt metal and scorched circuits hanging thick in the air. The team had managed to escape just before the detonation, their retreat punctuated by the groan of collapsing beams and the staccato of glass shattering. Now back at the barracks, silence filled the room, as oppressive as the smoke that had clung to their clothes. V-Gan sat on the edge of a metal bench, the weight of the night pressing down on him with relentless force. His hands were clasped together, knuckles white, eyes unfocused as he stared at the floor. Lucas's words echoed in his mind, each one a knife twisting deeper into the vulnerable places he thought he had long buried. Heroes like you only understand sacrifice when it's forced on them. Tonight you'll learn that lesson. The room buzzed with low murmurs as Syrah worked tirelessly at her console, fingers dancing over keys as she scanned for any surviving traces of Lucas's digital footprint. Wesley paced behind her, his typical levity absent, replaced by a tightly coiled energy that bordered on panic. Riker, ever the anchor, leaned against the wall, arms crossed, eyes sharp as he assessed the room. He's doing this to break us, Riker finally said, voice low but carrying enough to still the soft conversations. And it's working. Syrah's fingers paused for a beat before resuming their fevered pace. He won't win, she muttered, eyes flicking to V-Gan, who hadn't moved since they returned. We won't let him. But V-Gan heard the doubt buried beneath her conviction. The guilt that seeped through the cracks of their unity was palpable, and he could feel it settling into his own bones. Lucas's return wasn't just an attack on their city, it was an indictment of every choice he'd made since Lane's death, every failure that had led to this moment. Wesley stopped pacing, running a hand through his hair with a frustrated sigh. Why now? He said, looking at Riker. What's changed to make him resurface now, after all these years? Riker shook his head, the lines on his face deepening. It's not just now. He's been planning this for years, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Vasquez's fall created a vacuum, and Lucas seized it. Silence fell again, this time heavier, as if the room itself were holding its breath. V-Gan finally looked up, eyes haunted. "We're not facing just another enemy," he said, voice low and hoarse. "We're facing a man who knows us better than we know ourselves. He knows where we're strong, but more importantly, he knows where we're weak." Sarah's gaze softened, a flicker of empathy breaking through the storm. "You can't carry that alone, V-Gan," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "None of us can." He met her eyes, the tightness in his chest easing, if only for a moment. But the weight didn't leave. It shifted, changing from a crushing force to a shared burden. "We can't make the same mistakes," he said, the resolve in his voice hardening. "We need to understand Lucas, what broke him, and what he wants now. If we don't, we'll lose more than this fight. We'll lose the city." The echoes of the past. In the hours that followed, the team dispersed to rest or strategize in their own ways, but sleep was elusive. V-Gan found himself alone in the dim glow of the barracks training room. The walls were lined with old posters of past victories, moments frozen in time that now seemed like echoes of a simpler age. He stood in front of one, the image of Lane smiling and waving from a rooftop, triumphant after a battle they had fought together. "Was it enough, Lane?" he whispered to the silent room. "Did we do enough to deserve your faith?" He closed his eyes, memories flooding back unbidden. The laughter they shared during quiet moments, the way Lane's eyes would light up with boundless optimism even when everything seemed lost. And Lucas, always watching from the sidelines, a friend whose presence had been a comfort until it became a question mark. He remembered the last mission before Lane's death, the way Lucas had argued, his voice edged with a frustration that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than the task at hand. "You can't keep pretending everything's black and white, V-Gan. The world isn't like that, and neither are we." V-Gan had dismissed it then, thinking Lucas's disillusionment was just fatigue. But now, standing in the empty training room, the weight of that memory pressed down on him like a physical force. Fractures and conversations. In a quieter corner of the barracks, Sarah sat with Wesley, both of them sipping lukewarm coffee that tasted more like necessity than comfort. Wesley stared at the floor, eyes unfocused. "You think he blames us?" he asked suddenly, the question hanging in the air like a cloud. Sarah looked up, eyes softening. "Lucas?" she sighed. "I think he blames everything that failed Lane that day, including himself. But when grief twists into anger, it finds targets. It finds us." Wesley nodded, jaw tightening. "Then we need to show him that we're not the enemies he thinks we are." "It's more complicated than that," Sarah said, setting her cup down. "To Lucas, we're not people anymore. We're symbols, and you can't reason with symbols. You can only fight them." Riker walked in, catching the last of her words. "Then we make him see that we're not what he's turned us into. And we do it before he takes us apart from the inside." The three sat in silence, the reality of the challenge before them taking shape in their minds. It wasn't just a battle for the city, it was a battle for the soul of what they once believed they were and the truth they needed to reclaim. V-Gan appeared in the doorway, the weight on his shoulders now shared by the room. "We need to find him, and we need to make him talk. No more running, no more shadows." Sarah stood, the light catching in her eyes as determination replaced exhaustion. "Then let's bring him into the light." Chapter 27. The Heart of Darkness. The hidden headquarters of the Black Dusk was a stark contrast to the neon glow and bustling streets of Verde Heights. Here the only light came from dim overhead bulbs that flickered in rhythm with the hum of servers, casting long, distorted shadows on the walls. Lucas Rane stood at the center of the room, surrounded by his operatives. Their faces were unreadable beneath their masks, each one a silent echo of Lucas's own transformation from idealist to avenger. Ansel Thorne leaned casually against a nearby desk, arms crossed, his eyes sharp and calculating as he observed the room. Though he played the role of Lucas's confidant, there was a wariness in his gaze, as if he were studying a rare and dangerous creature. He respected Lucas's intellect, his relentless vision, but even Ansel wasn't blind to the bitterness that had shaped this mission. "Tonight was a near miss," Ansel said, voice smooth but edged with a hint of reproach. "They nearly got close enough to take you down. V-Gans people are more organized than you give them credit for." Lucas's jaw tightened, but he didn't look away from the monitors. Each screen displayed a different view of the city. A dark alley, a rundown neighborhood, the shimmering skyline. His gaze was focused, unflinching. "They're fighting a battle they don't understand," he replied, voice low and measured. "They think this is about power or territory, but they're wrong. This is about dismantling the illusion they've built around themselves." Ansel watched him, an eyebrow arching with quiet curiosity. "And what illusion is that exactly?" Lucas's hands curled into fists, his body radiating a cold intensity that even his operatives seemed to feel. "The illusion that they're heroes," he spat, the word laced with disdain. "V-Gan and his team hide behind the mask of justice, pretending they're different from the forces they claim to fight. But they're hypocrites, blind to the consequences of their failures." He looked down, his expression softening for a moment as a flicker of pain crossed his face. "They couldn't save Lane," he continued, voice barely above a whisper. "They promised protection, hope, unity. And when it mattered most, they failed, just like I did." Ansel's gaze sharpened. He had heard Lucas speak of Lane before, but rarely with such vulnerability. "You still hold on to that, don't you?" he asked, his tone softer. "That night." Lucas's eyes hardened again, the brief glimpse of sorrow vanishing as he clenched his fists. "That night was the end of any faith I had in heroes. Lane believed in them. He believed in us. And they let him die." He paused, his shoulders tensing as he exhaled a slow, steady breath. "When they failed him, they didn't just lose Lane. They lost me." One of the operatives shifted, drawing Lucas's attention. The operative's voice was distorted behind the mask, but there was an edge of respect, almost admiration. "If that's true, sir, then what is our goal here? Are we just destroying them to get even?" Lucas turned to face his team, his gaze piercing as he addressed them. "No," he said firmly, "this isn't about revenge. It's about showing Verde Heights the truth. V-Gan and his team are symbols, illusions that keep the people complacent, pacified. As long as they're seen as heroes, the city will cling to false hope instead of demanding real change." Ansel tilted his head, a glint of intrigue in his eyes. "And when you shatter those illusions, what then? Do you really think tearing down V-Gan will somehow empower the people?" Lucas's face hardened, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes, quickly buried. "The people will see that the power they need doesn't come from a single person or team. It comes from understanding that there is no savior coming for them. The world doesn't need heroes. It needs individuals who are willing to take control of their own fate." He stepped closer to Ansel, voice dropping to a murmur that only he could hear. "Heroes keep people dependent, waiting for salvation. But when you tear away the mask, when you reveal that they're flawed, human and powerless, people have no choice but to stand on their own." Ansel nodded, processing the weight of Lucas's words. He respected the logic, even admired the ruthlessness of the vision. But he couldn't shake the sense that Lucas's conviction was born as much from personal vendetta as it was from philosophy. The line between revenge and ideology blurred within Lucas, transforming him into a man who would stop at nothing to make the world feel his pain. "Then what's next?" Ansel asked, voice careful. "How do you break a man like V-Gan without risking him turning into a martyr?" Lucas's gaze flicked back to the monitors, his expression thoughtful, cold. "We don't just expose him. We make him doubt himself, his purpose, his very worth. We remind him that he's as flawed as the system he protects." He paused, eyes narrowing. "I want him to question everything he believes in until there's nothing left." Ansel's lips curled into a faint smile. "So you're going to make him destroy himself?" Lucas nodded. "And in doing so, he'll take down everyone who believes in him. His own guilt will unravel the team. The fractures are already there. All we have to do is widen them." The room fell silent, each operative absorbing the plan with a mix of reverence and fear. They knew Lucas's methods were unrelenting, that he would push the boundaries of what was considered necessary until V-Gan and his team were left clinging to scraps of their shattered ideals. Ansel watched Lucas carefully, noting the strain behind the man's icy resolve. He leaned in, voice low and perceptive. "Are you sure this is the way? You say it's not revenge, but it looks an awful lot like it." Lucas's jaw tightened, but he met Ansel's gaze without flinching. "Revenge is personal," he said, his voice a cold whisper. "This is about justice. It's about making sure no one else suffers the way Lane did, the way I did." Ansel nodded, but his eyes glinted with a quiet understanding. "Just remember, Lucas, when you turn a hero into a villain, you run the risk of becoming one yourself." Lucas didn't respond, his gaze fixed on the screens as images of V-Gan and his team flickered in front of him, oblivious to the storm that was gathering. He knew Ansel's words held truth, but he also knew he couldn't turn back. He had committed to this path, and the city's false heroes would fall by his hand, no matter the cost. No more illusions, he thought, jaw set in grim determination. The world will see that even heroes bleed. Chapter 28, Cracks in the Armor. The barracks that had once buzzed with a sense of shared purpose now carried a palpable tension that lingered in every shadowed corner and echoed through every hushed conversation. The team moved through the hallways and rooms with guarded expressions, their eyes betraying the unease that clung to them like an invisible shroud. They knew they were being watched, tested, and it gnawed at their trust in one another. V-Gan stood at the war table, the surface cluttered with maps, files, and hastily scribbled notes. His eyes scanned the latest intelligence reports, but the words blurred together, weighted by doubt. Lucas's voice, mocking and familiar, whispered through his thoughts, dredging up old insecurities that coiled tight around his chest. "Still no new leads?" Riker's voice cut through the silence, rough and edged with the frustration that had settled between them all. V-Gan's jaw tightened as he looked up, meeting Riker's gaze. The captain's eyes were sharp, searching for answers V-Gan didn't have. "Nothing concrete," V-Gan admitted, the confession landing heavy in the room. "Lucas knows us too well. He's staying one step ahead." Riker's eyes narrowed, arms crossing over his chest as he leaned against the table. "Or maybe he's not alone. It's no coincidence that he always seems to anticipate our next move. Someone could be feeding him information." The implication sent a ripple through the room, eyes darting toward each other before quickly looking away. Her trust had been their greatest weapon, but now it felt fragile, like glass ready to shatter at the slightest pressure. Wesley's voice broke the silence, laced with defensive humor that barely masked the edge of worry. "You're suggesting we've got a mole? Come on, Riker, you've been watching too many old spy dramas." Riker didn't smile. "I'm suggesting we need to be vigilant. Lucas doesn't have to be alone to be dangerous. He's already proven that." Syrah, who had been listening quietly from her seat by the monitors, finally spoke up. "We can't start turning on each other. That's exactly what he wants." Her eyes met V-Gan's, searching for reassurance that he was still the leader she knew, still the man they could rely on. "If we let suspicion take root, we're doing his work for him." V-Gan's chest tightened at her words. She was right, but even knowing that, the doubt remained, festering like an open wound. "We keep our focus on the mission," he said, forcing his voice to carry authority. "We don't give Lucas the satisfaction of seeing us break." Private doubts. Later, the barracks settled into an uneasy quiet. V-Gan stood alone in the gym, the rhythmic thud of his fists against a punching bag, the only sound breaking the silence. Each hit was harder than the last, each strike a futile attempt to expel the gnawing doubt inside him. "Taking out your frustration on the equipment." Wesley's voice echoed from the doorway, his usual smirk softened with concern. V-Gan paused, muscles tense and sweat dripping down his face. "Better the bag than one of us," he said, half a joke that fell flat between them. Wesley stepped in, hands shoved into his pockets. "I know Riker's got everyone on edge, but he's wrong about a mole. You know that, right? We're all in this together." V-Gan met Wesley's gaze, the trust in his friend's eyes a stark reminder of what was at stake. "I want to believe that," he admitted. "But Lucas knows us too well. He's been precise, surgical. It's not just luck. Someone out there is helping him. Wesley's eyes darkened and he nodded, his usual levity giving way to grim determination. Then we find them. But we don't let paranoia destroy what we've got left. A fracture deepens. Meanwhile, in the barracks' makeshift command center, Sierra sat surrounded by glowing screens and the soft hum of machinery. She had spent hours combing through encrypted files, looking for any trace of Lucas's recent communications or alliances. The exhaustion was bone deep, but rest wasn't an option. Every moment she spent searching was a moment closer to finding Lucas. Or so she told herself. Riker entered, his presence as heavy as his silence. He watched her for a moment before speaking. "You haven't stopped since we got back. You need to take a break, Sarah." She didn't look up. "I can't. If there's a pattern, I have to find it." Riker's eyes narrowed, suspicion flickering in the depths. "You've always been good at finding patterns. Almost too good. You and Lucas spent a lot of time together before he disappeared, didn't you?" Sarah's fingers paused over the keyboard, the room's temperature seeming to drop with his words. She turned slowly, eyes narrowing as she met his gaze. "What are you implying, Riker?" He took a step forward, arms crossed. "I'm not implying anything. I'm saying that Lucas isn't the only one who knows us, knows our routines. If there's someone he's working with, it wouldn't be a stretch to think it could be someone who understands us, someone close." Sarah stood, the chair scraping back with a harsh sound. "I'm as committed to this team as you are. Lucas and I may have worked together, but I never—" She stopped, the hurt in her eyes quickly masked by anger. "I'm not the enemy here." The silence between them was brittle, ready to snap. Finally, Riker sighed, some of the tension easing from his frame. "I know. But we can't afford any blind spots, not now." Sarah's jaw clenched, but she nodded. "Then we keep looking. We find him before he finds a way to tear us apart." The watchful eye, outside the barracks, high above the city in a derelict building that had once been an office tower, Lucas Runn watched through a set of binoculars. The scene unfolding within the barracks was one he knew well. The fractures he had planted were growing, subtle but sure. He could almost hear their conversations, the rising tension, the whispers of doubt. Ansel stepped up beside him, a knowing smile playing at his lips. "It's working. They're starting to fray." Lucas lowered the binoculars, eyes locked on the lights of the barracks. "Good," he said, voice devoid of triumph, "but this is only the beginning. We're going to push them until they can't tell friend from foe." Ansel's smile faded as he noted the lack of satisfaction in Lucas's tone. "And when they break, what then?" Lucas's eyes, hard and haunted, turned to Ansel. "Then they'll understand that their fight was never about protecting the city. It was about surviving the lie they built for themselves." Ansel nodded slowly, stepping back into the shadows. But Lucas remained, eyes trained on the barracks, where the lights glowed defiantly in the dark. His resolve was as cold and unyielding as ever, but deep down, in a place he didn't dare acknowledge, he wondered if any victory would be enough to silence the echoes of the past. Chapter 29. The Breakthrough. The barracks were bathed in the soft glow of monitors and the steady hum of equipment as Sarah worked late into the night. The air was heavy with tension, a shared silence that spoke of exhaustion and unspoken fears. V-Gans stood nearby, arms crossed and eyes fixed on the scrolling code on the screen, searching for any sign of hope. Wesley sat at a makeshift workstation, tapping his pen against the table as he reviewed old records and notes. Every lead they had chased so far had crumbled under scrutiny, each dead end adding to the weight pressing down on their shoulders. But tonight felt different. There was a charge in the air, an electric sense of anticipation that kept them going despite the fatigue. "I think I found something," Sarah said suddenly, her voice cutting through the quiet like a blade. The room stilled, eyes snapping to her as she typed rapidly, lines of data reflected in her tired but determined eyes. "What is it?" V-Gans stepped forward, leaning over her shoulder to see the screen. The faint glow illuminated the sharp lines of his face, shadowed with worry. Sarah's fingers danced over the keyboard, her breath quickening. "Lucas has been masking his communications through a series of proxy networks, very sophisticated but not perfect. He slipped up during his last message to the operatives at the docks. I managed to track it to a secondary relay point just outside the city, in the old industrial sector. Wesley's eyes widened, the pen slipping from his fingers. The industrial sector. That place has been a ghost town for years. If he's holed up there, it's the perfect spot, isolated with a labyrinth of abandoned factories and tunnels. Riker entered the room, catching the tail end of Sierra's explanation. If we've got a location, we need to move. Lucas won't stay put for long if he suspects we're onto him. V-Gan nodded, a flicker of hope breaking through his exhaustion. We prepare now. Riker, assemble a small team. We go in quiet and fast. The calm before the storm. As the team gathered their gear and prepared for the mission, the tension in the room shifted from unease to steely resolve. Wesley checked the comms, ensuring their encrypted channels were secure, while Sierra loaded her portable tech pack with the tools they'd need to navigate the maze of the industrial sector. V-Gan pulled Riker aside, his voice low. We can't afford any mistakes. Lucas is more than capable of setting traps that will draw us in and break us one by one. Riker's eyes hardened, the weight of the mission pressing down on both of them. We'll be ready. But you know he's expecting this, right? He's led us to him before, only to vanish when we thought we had the upper hand. V-Gan's jaw clenched, memories of past failures and Lucas's haunting words gnawing at him. Not this time. If he's drawn us here, it's because he wants to face us. We need to be prepared for anything. Into the shadows, the old industrial sector loomed ahead, its silhouette a jagged maze of rusting metal and decaying structures. The moon cast a cold silver light over the scene, making the shadows deeper, more threatening. The air was thick with the scent of oil and the faint metallic tang of old machinery left to rot. The team moved in pairs, each step careful, the silence only broken by the crunch of gravel beneath their boots. Wesley scanned the area with a portable device, its soft beeping marking the presence of electronic signals. There's definitely something active here, he whispered, eyes darting around the dark expanse. Sierra's heart thudded in her chest, the adrenaline making every sound seem louder, every shadow deeper. She glanced at V-Gan, who moved with the focus of a man who carried the weight of more than just this mission. She saw it in the tightness of his shoulders, the way his eyes flicked to every possible threat. He was hunting, not just for Lucas, but for the part of himself that had been lost in the betrayal. Over here, Riker's voice crackled softly over the comms. He had found an entrance, an old maintenance door hidden behind a pile of corroded pipes. It was slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness beyond. V-Gan nodded, signaling for the team to follow. They slipped inside, flashlights cutting narrow beams through the inky black. The interior was a labyrinth of rusted catwalks, hanging chains that clinked softly as they brushed against them, and the skeletal remains of old machinery. The air was colder here, carrying the subtle hum of electricity that didn't belong in a place abandoned for years. Sierra's fingers tightened around her tablet as she scanned the space, eyes narrowing as data flashed across the screen. There's a power source somewhere deeper inside, she whispered. He's here. A noise, sudden and metallic, echoed through the space. The team froze, eyes darting to the source. Before they could react, the speakers hidden in the corners of the room crackled to life. You found me, Lucas's voice said, smooth and cold, filling the space with an omnipresent presence. I was wondering how long it would take. V-Gan's heart thudded in his chest, eyes searching the shadows for any sign of movement. Show yourself, Lucas, he shouted, the echo of his voice swallowed by the cavernous room. Laughter, hollow and mocking, responded. Why would I do that when I can watch you unravel right here? You're predictable, V-Gan, still chasing ghosts. The team shifted uneasily, weapons drawn and eyes scanning for any sign of an ambush. Riker signaled for them to spread out, each step cautious as they advanced. Sierra's screen flashed with an alert, her eyes widening. It's a trap, she said, voice urgent. The power source is rigged too. But her words were cut off as lights exploded into blinding brilliance and a series of charges detonated, sending shockwaves through the space. The room filled with smoke and the sound of twisting metal, a cacophony that drowned out their shouts and the urgent scramble for cover. V-Gan's vision blurred as he was thrown against a wall, the taste of blood sharp in his mouth. Through the haze, he saw a figure step out of the smoke, a familiar mask glinting under the harsh light. Welcome to my game, Lucas said, voice low and full of menace. Let's see how far you're willing to go to save what's left of your team. As the smoke began to clear and the sound of groaning metal settled into silence, the reality of Lucas's trap became chillingly clear. The hunt had only just begun, and the stakes were higher than ever. Chapter 30. Face to Face. The industrial sector lay shrouded in smoke and the tang of scorched metal. The echoes of the explosion reverberated through the space, followed by a ringing silence that felt more oppressive than the chaos that preceded it. V-Gan pushed himself to his feet, muscles screaming in protest as he staggered to regain his bearings. His vision swam, but through the settling haze he saw the figure standing motionless in the shadows. Lucas Rane stepped forward, the mask he wore gleaming in the fractured light of emergency strobes. His eyes, cold and calculating, locked onto V-Gan with an intensity that pierced the hero to his core. "So, this is what's left of the Great Protector," Lucas said, voice smooth and mocking, "chasing ghosts and finding only ashes." V-Gan clenched his fists, the weight of his failure threatening to drag him down. But he steadied himself, eyes narrowing as he took a step forward. "You don't have to do this, Lucas. Whatever vengeance you're after, there's another way." Lucas's lips curled into a faint smile, humorless and sharp. "Vengeance?" He shook his head slowly. "You still don't get it, do you? This isn't about revenge. This is about the truth you all refuse to see." Serra's voice crackled in his earpiece, strained but alive. "V-Gan, we're regrouping. Be careful." V-Gan didn't respond, his focus entirely on Lucas. "Then tell me, Lucas, what truth is worth this?" He gestured to the ruined space, the chaos that had threatened the lives of his team and countless others. "What are you trying to prove?" Lucas's eyes softened, almost imperceptibly, and for a moment he looked like the man V-Gan had once trusted, the ally who had stood in the shadows with Lane. But the moment passed and his expression hardened. "I'm proving that heroes are just an illusion, symbols the city clings to while the real rot festers beneath. Lane believed in you in all of this." He gestured to the symbol on V-Gan's chest. "But when it came down to it, your heroism was as fragile as glass." V-Gan's heart clenched at the mention of Lane, the guilt that had haunted him for years flaring hot and sharp. "Lane's death wasn't just on me," he said, voice rough. "We all failed him that day, but turning the city against itself won't change that. It won't bring him back." Lucas's eyes flashed, a raw pain cutting through his composed mask. "No, it won't bring him back," he agreed, voice tight, "but it will stop others from believing in the lie that someone will always be there to save them. People need to understand that they can't rely on heroes, that they need to take power into their own hands. Only then will the city truly be free." A murmur of static interrupted the charged silence, and Wesley's voice came through, urgent and breathless. "V-Gan, we're closing in on your position. Hold tight." Lucas's eyes flicked to the side, noting the incoming backup. "It seems your team is loyal, even when they shouldn't be," he said, taking a step back into the shadows. "Let's see how long that lasts when the fractures deepen." Before V-Gan could react, Lucas pressed a button on his wrist. A low hum filled the room as hidden doors slid open, revealing a labyrinth of corridors lit by flickering industrial lights. Lucas disappeared into one, his footsteps swallowed by the mechanical groan of metal shifting. "Damn it," V-Gan muttered, rushing after him. The hall was narrow, lined with old pipes that hissed and leaked steam. The path forked ahead, and for a moment he hesitated, listening for any clue as to which way Lucas had gone. Sierra and Riker appeared behind him, breathless and covered in grime. "He's trying to lead you into another trap," Riker warned, gun raised as he scanned the space. V-Gan met Sierra's eyes, searching for the balance between hope and realism that she always carried. "He said he's trying to show the city it doesn't need heroes, that it needs to learn to stand on its own." Sierra's face fell, understanding and sadness flickering across her features. "He's not just fighting us, he's trying to rewrite everything Lane stood for." Riker's eyes darkened as the realization settled in. "And he's doing it by breaking the team that Lane trusted most." A sudden echo of footsteps reached them, and V-Gan's focus snapped back. "We end this now," he said, the resolve in his voice burning away the doubt. "We bring Lucas back, or we stop him before he can tear the city apart." They moved as one, following the sound deeper into the labyrinth, their shadows dancing on the walls as the hunt resumed. The city above slept, unaware that in these tunnels the battle for its future raged on, driven by old betrayals and the ghost of a friend who had believed too fiercely in a world that never existed. Chapter 31. Ghosts of the Past. The corridors of the labyrinth twisted like the coils of a great iron serpent. Deep in its heart, Lucas Rane stood in a control room, bathed in the low glow of outdated monitors and blinking consoles. The rhythmic pulse of emergency lights cast sharp shadows across his face, making the lines of exhaustion and determination deeper, more pronounced. The walls hummed with the mechanical sounds of shifting gears and the thrum of electricity coursing through exposed wires. It was a place that mirrored Lucas himself. Fractured, half-forgotten, yet pulsing with purpose. He reached up and pulled off his mask, feeling the cool air kiss the scar that ran from his temple to his jawline, a memento from the night that had changed everything. Lane's laughter echoed in his mind, a memory so vivid it made his heart clench. He remembered a time before everything unraveled, when they had all believed in the same things: justice, unity, a world that could be better because they were there to make it so. "You're too serious, Lucas," Lane had once said, his grin wide and irreverent. "You need to lighten up, or you're going to scare people off before they even see how brilliant you are." Lucas's lips twitched, a ghost of a smile that vanished as quickly as it appeared. Lane had been the heart of their trio, the voice that kept doubt at bay, even when missions failed and their vision of the world began to splinter. V-Gan had been the strength, the unyielding force that rallied them when the nights were long and the threats too numerous to count. And Lucas had been the mind, the strategist, the one who saw the pitfalls no one else would consider. Until the day it all fell apart. The monitors in front of him blinked with static and the grainy images of V-Gan and his team navigating the labyrinth. They were closing in, their determination palpable even through the screen. Lucas's eyes narrowed as he watched them move with a unity that twisted something deep inside him. It was the same unity that had driven Lane to sacrifice himself, believing they could make a difference. "It's too late for that kind of hope," Lucas murmured, fingers tightening around the edge of the console. He remembered the mission that had shattered them, the mission where Lane's voice had cut off mid-command, replaced by silence and the smoldering aftermath of Vasquez's betrayal. Lucas had been just out of reach, too far to help, but close enough to hear Lane's last breath. He had waited for V-Gan to save him, to charge in with the unstoppable resolve that had defined him. But the hero had faltered, trapped by an ambush that Lucas had tried to warn them about. In that moment, Lucas's faith in heroes crumbled. The system they believed in hadn't just failed Lane, it had failed them all. And in the quiet aftermath, with Lane gone and the team shattered, Lucas realized that the only way to change the world was to dismantle the myths that kept people complacent. The door behind him opened with a mechanical hiss, and Ansel Thorne stepped inside, his expression as cool and unreadable as ever. "They're close," he said, eyes flicking to the monitors. "This will be the final stand." Lucas nodded, his expression unreadable. "Good," he said, though the word carried no satisfaction, only resignation. "They need to see." Ansel tilted his head, a hint of curiosity breaking through his practiced calm. "Do you really think they'll understand? Or are you just hoping they break before they reach you?" Lucas's jaw clenched, the echoes of Lane's voice mingling with the reality of now, the way V-Gan's face had been lined with guilt and determination when Lucas taunted him earlier. "I don't care if they understand," he said, the lie sour on his tongue. "They just need to face the truth." But even as he spoke, doubt gnawed at him. What if he was wrong? What if this battle, this crusade he had embarked on, was nothing more than a hollow act of vengeance masquerading as justice? The scar on his face throbbed, a painful reminder of the night he'd realized that faith in heroes was a weapon that cut both ways. Ansel studied him for a moment, eyes narrowing as if seeing deeper than Lucas intended. "If this is the end, you should be sure, Lucas. Because once the dust settles, there's no going back." Lucas met Ansel's gaze, eyes cold and resolute. "There never was," he said. The monitors flickered again, showing V-Gan and the team reaching the final corridor, their movements quick and coordinated. The confrontation was moments away. Lucas put the mask back on, the weight of it familiar, grounding. The time for doubt had passed. He would see this through, for Lane, for himself, and for a city that needed to understand that heroism was a myth that could no longer sustain them. This ends tonight, he thought, stepping forward to meet the ghosts of his past. Chapter 32. The Reckoning. The corridor was narrow, the sound of the team's footsteps echoing against the steel walls. The labyrinth had given way to a central chamber, a space dominated by old industrial consoles and dim, flickering lights. V-Gan led the way, his breath steady but deep, eyes scanning for movement. Behind him, Riker and Sierra advanced cautiously, weapons drawn, while Wesley stayed back, his fingers twitching near the emergency EMP device clipped to his belt. A figure emerged from the shadows at the far end of the room, stepping forward with the deliberate grace of a predator. Lucas Rane stood tall, clad in dark tactical armor that made him seem like a shadow carved from the night itself. The mask he wore glinted as it caught the light, but it was the eyes behind it, cold, calculating, and filled with a deep, gnawing ache, that held V-Gan's attention. "Lucas," V-Gan said, voice low but commanding. The silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of years, of shared victories and devastating loss. Lucas inclined his head slightly, a gesture that might have once been friendly, but now held an air of bitter irony. "You found me," he said, voice muffled by the mask. He scanned the faces of the team, lingering on Sierra, who stood with a mix of anger and sadness in her eyes. "And you brought them all, loyalty, even in the face of failure. It's almost admirable." V-Gan stepped forward, fists clenched at his sides. "This isn't you, Lucas. It doesn't have to be. We can end this without more bloodshed." A hollow laugh echoed from behind the mask. Lucas's posture relaxed, though his eyes never lost their sharpness. "Always the optimist, aren't you?" He glanced at the team, each of them poised for a fight. "You still believe in your version of heroism, that there's a solution where everyone wins?" "Because it's true," V-Gan said, his voice hardening. "Lane believed it. He believed in us, in you." Lucas flinched at the mention of Lane's name, and for a moment the mask of control slipped. His eyes flashed with something raw, a grief so deep it felt endless. "Don't you dare speak his name as if you still deserve it," he snapped, taking a step closer. "Lane died believing in a lie. He died because we put our faith in a system that was never going to save us. You failed him, just like I did." Syrah's voice trembled as she spoke, but it held an edge of defiance. "We all did, Lucas. We lost him, and it broke us. But this," she gestured to the room, to the plans he had laid and the city he had pushed to the brink. "This won't bring him back." Lucas's eyes met hers, and the hardness in them softened for a heartbeat. "No," he admitted, voice quieter, almost resigned. "It won't. But it will make sure no one else dies believing that salvation comes from someone wearing a mask." V-Gan's jaw tightened, the weight of Lucas's words sinking into him. He had replayed Lane's death in his mind countless times, the helplessness, the roar of failure that had drowned out reason. And he knew Lucas had done the same, each recollection carving another scar into his soul. But Lucas had taken that grief and let it twist him, turn him into the very thing they had fought against. "Lane didn't believe in symbols," V-Gan said, taking another step forward. "He believed in people, in their capacity to rise above their mistakes, to become more than their failures. This city doesn't need to be saved from hope, Lucas. It needs to be reminded of it." Lucas's expression darkened, the soft moment gone as rage replaced it. "Hope," he spat, the word laced with venom. "Hope is what keeps people passive. It's what lets them sit back and watch as their world burns, waiting for a savior that never comes." He stepped into the light, raising his hands, revealing the detonator strapped to his wrist. "And tonight, I will make sure they understand that truth. No more heroes, no more illusions." Before anyone could react, a shot rang out. Riker's gun smoked from where he stood, the bullet aimed at Lucas's hand. Lucas flinched, but he was too fast. He spun away, the shot grazing his arm as he triggered the room's defenses. Sirens wailed, and the chamber filled with the rumble of automated turrets sliding into place. Get down, V-Gan shouted, diving for cover as a barrage of gunfire erupted. The team scattered, taking cover behind metal consoles as bullets ricocheted around them. Lucas retreated to a high platform, eyes locked with V-Gan as the chaos unfolded. "You think you can stop me? You think you can save them?" he shouted over the din, his voice a mix of fury and desperation. "You couldn't save him, and you won't save them either." The words struck V-Gan like a blow, but they also ignited something in him. A refusal to let Lane's memory be twisted, a determination to reach the friend he had lost before it was too late. He glanced at Sarah, who nodded, eyes fierce with resolve. They had come this far together, and they would finish this together. V-Gan rose from cover, muscles coiled as he met Lucas's gaze. "I couldn't save him, but I won't let his memory be used for this," he said, voice clear and unwavering. "This ends now, Lucas. Not with destruction, but with the truth, the real truth." Lucas hesitated, the words cutting through his anger like a blade. For a moment he faltered, the grief in his eyes laid bare. But the hesitation was fleeting. He pressed the detonator and the room shuddered as the countdown began. "If you want the truth," Lucas said, stepping back into the shadows, "you'll have to earn it." The seconds ticked down, and the fight for the city's soul surged forward. A battle not just against an enemy, but against the weight of their shared history. Chapter 33, A Battle of Hearts and Shadows. The chamber was a cacophony of noise and violence. The countdown on Lucas's detonator blared, its red numbers slicing through the chaos like a siren of impending doom. Automated turrets roared to life, their gunfire ricocheting off metal consoles and sending sparks skittering across the floor. The air was thick with the acrid tang of gunpowder and the hum of old machinery, creating a symphony of dread that resonated in the bones of everyone present. V-Gan pushed through the onslaught, heart pounding, as he locked eyes with Lucas, who stood poised on the high platform, shadowed but unyielding. The flickering light played across Lucas's mask, casting harsh angles that made him seem more spectre than man. Sirah's voice called out from somewhere behind a console. "V-Gan, we don't have time. He's going to blow the whole place." He didn't respond. There was no time for words, no time to convince anyone but Lucas. This wasn't just a fight, it was a reckoning years in the making. V-Gan leapt up onto the nearest platform, the metal groaning under his weight. Lucas turned to face him, the distance between them a chasm carved by grief, guilt, and betrayal. "You never knew how to let go, did you?" Lucas shouted, voice cutting through the noise as he drew a blade from his belt, its edge gleaming with deadly intent. Always holding on to hope, like it's something real. V-Gan stepped forward, fists clenched at his sides. "I held on because Lane did," he said, the name punching through the barrier of grief between them. "And deep down, so did you. That's why you're here. This isn't just about proving a point. This is about him." Lucas's eyes flickered, the blade in his hand trembling for a split second before his grip tightened. "Lane died for nothing," he spat, each word edged with bitterness. "He believed in you, in this team, and it killed him." "No," V-Gan said, voice steady and firm. "Lane died because of Vasquez's betrayal, and we couldn't stop it. But what you're doing now, you're making him a weapon, twisting his memory into something he would never have wanted." Lucas lunged, the blade slicing through the space between them. V-Gan dodged, the movement precise and fluid, but he didn't counterattack. He couldn't. Not yet. This fight wasn't about defeating Lucas, it was about reaching him. "I lost him too, Lucas," V-Gan said, sidestepping another slash, the blade cutting a thin line across his arm. The pain was sharp, but it grounded him. "I've lived with that failure every day, just like you have. But we can't let it define us. He wouldn't want that." Lucas's breath came in ragged gasps, his eyes wild with a storm of emotions, rage, pain, and a fear he couldn't mask. What would Lane want then? For us to go on pretending everything is fine? For people to keep believing in lies? V-Gan took another step closer, the distance between them closing. "Lane would want us to fight for the hope he carried, not destroy it. He believed in us, not because we were perfect, but because we tried to be better. We don't have to be heroes, Lucas. We just have to be more than this." The words seemed to hang in the air, pressing down on Lucas with a weight that made his shoulders sag. His mask slipped as his eyes, once so cold, filled with unshed tears. The hand holding the blade trembled again, and this time it faltered. "I tried," Lucas whispered, the voice of the man he had once been breaking through the cold mask of vengeance. "I tried to be what he believed in, but when he died, all I could see was the lie we were living." The countdown continued, the red numbers burning in V-Gan's peripheral vision. He reached out, his own hand shaking as it neared Lucas's. It wasn't a lie. Lane knew the risks, but he chose to fight anyway. We all did. And we still can. For a moment, it seemed as though Lucas would lower the blade, the storm in his eyes abating as he looked at V-Gan and saw not the hero, but the friend who had stood beside him through so many battles. But then the red numbers flashed brighter, and Lucas's gaze shifted to them, panic overtaking reason. "No," Lucas said, the word barely a breath as he moved to activate the detonator. But V-Gan was faster. He lunged, grabbing Lucas's wrist and wrenching it away from the button. They struggled, the platform swaying under their combined weight, the sound of their grunts and the creaking metal swallowed by the roar of the turrets and the alarms. "Lucas, stop!" V-Gan shouted, his grip tightening as the detonator slipped from Lucas's hand and clattered to the floor. The blade fell too, landing between them with a metallic clang. Lucas's chest heaved, his eyes wide and searching V-Gan's face for something. Understanding, absolution, an answer that neither of them had found. Syrah's voice rang out, triumphant and urgent. "I've disabled the charges. It's over." Lucas's eyes flicked to her, then back to V-Gan. The fight drained out of him, leaving only the broken man who had been lost for so long. "It's over," he echoed, voice hollow, the weight of his crusade pressing down like a final judgment. V-Gan stepped back, releasing Lucas's wrist. The team surrounded them now, weapons lowered but eyes wary. The silence that followed was deafening. A moment suspended between forgiveness and consequence. Lucas dropped to his knees, the mask slipping from his face and clattering beside the blade. He looked up at V-Gan, eyes brimming with exhaustion and the kind of grief that left scars deeper than any wound. "What now?" he whispered. V-Gan's eyes softened, the ghost of Lane's laughter echoing in the back of his mind. He reached out, not as a hero, but as a friend. "Now we find a way forward, together." And in that moment, with the echoes of their battle still ringing in the air, they took the first step toward reclaiming what had been lost. Epilogue, Shadows and Light. The city of Verde Heights was healing. The scars of battle and betrayal still marred its streets, but in the soft glow of dawn, hope threaded through the chaos like veins of gold. Citizens emerged from their homes, cautious but curious, their eyes searching the skyline for a sign that peace, however fragile, had returned. In the barracks, the silence was a different kind, pensive, steeped in the weight of what had been lost and gained. V-Gan stood at the window, watching the city stir to life. The sun crept up over the jagged rooftops, bathing them in light that felt almost forgiving. He closed his eyes, letting the warmth touch his face as the echoes of the battle played in his mind. Lucas's voice, the fear in Syrah's eyes, the tight grip of Riker's hand on his shoulder as they realized they had won, but at what cost? Behind him, Syrah entered, her footsteps soft. She carried a thin file, papers filled with reports, and the remnants of Lane's handwritten notes. "They're already talking about rebuilding," she said, a small smile breaking through her exhaustion. "People are starting to believe in the idea of moving forward." V-Gan opened his eyes and turned, meeting hers with a look that spoke of shared trials and unspoken understanding. "It's what we fought for," he replied, the words heavy with the knowledge of how close they had come to losing everything. "Lucas is being held at a secure facility," Syrah said, her voice hesitant. "He's different now, quieter. I think he's starting to realize what this all meant, for Lane, for us." She paused, placing the file on the table between them. "I'm not sure what justice looks like for him." V-Gan sighed, glancing at the papers. Lane's familiar handwriting reached out from the past, a reminder that some battles left marks that could never be seen, but were felt all the same. "Justice isn't always punishment," he said finally. "Sometimes it's a chance to make things right." They stood in silence, the weight of Lane's memory hanging between them, not as a spectre, but as a light guiding them forward. A new dawn. On the other side of the city, Riker watched as the early morning sun painted the buildings in hues of gold and amber. The industrial sector still bore the marks of Lucas's final stand: shattered windows, scorched metal. But it felt different now, less like a monument to failure and more like a starting point. Wesley appeared beside him, hands shoved into his pockets. "Hard to believe it's over," he said, a note of disbelief in his voice. "Or is it?" Riker smirked, the shadow of a grin that showed more weariness than amusement. "It's never really over. But we've got time now, time to rebuild, to prepare. Lucas showed us where we were weak, but he also reminded us why we fight." Wesley nodded, the two of them sharing a quiet moment of understanding. "Lane would have liked that," Wesley added, eyes distant as he thought of their fallen friend. "He'd say we're stubborn enough to figure it out." "Yeah," Riker agreed, the word tinged with a rare softness. He would. A glimpse of tomorrow. In the secure facility where Lucas was held, the room was quiet, lit only by a thin strip of morning light that filtered through the high window. He sat on the edge of the cot, eyes unfocused as he traced the line of the scar on his face. The mask he had worn lay on the table beside him, a relic of a past that had led him to this moment. The door opened and V-Gan entered, the two of them sharing a long, weighted silence before V-Gan spoke. "The city's beginning to heal," he said, voice calm but cautious. Lucas didn't look up. "They'll need more than hope to survive what's coming." V-Gan's eyes narrowed, a question forming but left unasked as he took in Lucas's hollow expression. There was no defiance left, only a man stripped down to the remnants of his beliefs. "We'll be ready," V-Gan said, as much a promise to himself as to Lucas. Lucas met his eyes at last, the flicker of something unreadable crossing his face. "I hope so," he whispered, the words carrying a weight that made V-Gan pause. As V-Gan left the room, the echoes of Lucas's final statement clung to him, the suggestion that while one battle had ended, others were already stirring in the dark corners of the world. The road ahead would be long, filled with new threats and old ghosts, but they would face it together. This time, armed not just with strength, but with the lessons learned and the hope that Lane's memory had lit within them all. Outside, the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows that spoke of a city reborn, of heroes redefined, and of battles yet to come. End of Part 1.